The surgery department was in the usual early week bustle. Some patients were being discharged, others, on the contrary, were arriving. The nurse at the post formalized new arrivals. Doctors were carrying out initial examinations, drawing up appointment sheets, and only the office of the head was quiet. But only silence had its own special meaning. The head of the ward had set up a very strange machine on his desk, the sight of which gave Amanda Swan, the nurse, a strange sense of unease. "Mr. Andrew Brown, what is this?" she asked quietly. "What is it?" "A polygraph, Swan. What else is it?" "You don't want to tell the truth." "I don't have time to wait for you to confess. We're going to hook up all the wires and find out what's what," said the doctor. The nurse shuddered. "But it's probably illegal. And you need my consent, isn't it?" Mr. Andrew Brown raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Consent? Don't you agree? When I took the patient's bracelet, I didn't ask for consent." "I didn't. That's not true. Why would I do that? My job is more important to me," Amanda argued vehemently. But the superintendent was not at all convinced by her tirade. Not only that, he gently sat her down on a chair and began attaching sensors to her body. The sticky suction cups against her skin made Amanda uncomfortable. "My God, what is this?" she thought. She was being accused of stealing something she hadn't done. It's just unthinkable. Yes, Amanda grew up in an orphanage, but she'd never taken anything that wasn't hers. And what would she do with that bracelet? Meanwhile, Mr. Andrew Brown had finished his final preparations and was getting down to business. But to make the procedure look more or less legal, he invited Amanda's colleague, a nurse, as a witness. "Helen, is Swan willing to tell the truth or not?" He began with a routine screening question. "Agreed?" "I do," she answered timidly. At the same moment, there was a single, barely audible squeak, and the superintendent smiled. "Well, now you're telling the truth. So let's move on to the more difficult question. Did you take the bracelet from businessman Pattison?" Amanda looked fearfully at her boss. "No, of course not. I already told you that." The polygraph squeaked again. In a slightly different tone, though. Mr. Andrew Brown frowned. "Strange. This signal corresponds to neither yes nor no. What is that supposed to mean?" "Amanda must not have taken that bracelet," Helen helpfully suggested. "What about Mr. John Pattison saying that the bracelet disappeared as soon as Amanda entered his room?" the ward manager objected. "That's not true, Mr. Brown. It's a lie. There was a notary besides me. He came out after me when I was scrubbing the floor," Amanda exclaimed, and the polygraph beeped in agreement. The doctor, stunned, shook his head. "Wow, she's telling the truth. Technology, my arse." Amanda, realizing that there was no way to avoid further questioning, prepared for the worst. "So, Swan, have you heard who Mr. John Pattison left everything to?" The superintendent persisted. She lowered her eyes. "I did, but I didn't do it on purpose. It's just that the notary insisted that the will be drawn up soon. Mr. John Pattison was in a bad way, so they started in front of me." Mr. Andrew Brown's eyes flashed strangely. "Who did it all go to, Swan?" "Don't be silent. The polygraph, is a delicate thing. It'll find out everything, and it'll get what it wants." Amanda frowned. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I have the right to divulge what I've heard. And as for the bracelet, I didn't take it." The polygraph confirmed her words again, which made the superintendent cringe like a toothache. "No, Swan. You took the bracelet. Tell me, did you hold it in your hand?" Amanda turned pale, realizing where the boss was going with this. "No, I did not." At that moment, the polygraph beeped in protest, which brought a smile to the superintendent's face. "Now you're lying, Swan, and you're not blushing." "No, I'm not. I picked it up, but not to steal it," the nurse tearfully exclaimed. But it was too late. Mr. Andrew Brown had taken the sensors off her and, unashamed of Helen's presence, called her a thief. But it wasn't my fault. Amanda made excuses. Then the superintendent began to scold her to the full, threatening her with criminal prosecution and other troubles. Helen tactfully walked out at that moment. She didn't want to be present at such an unpleasant scene. After about 10 minutes, the anger of the head of the department began to subside. After he had calmed down a little, he said, "Anyway, Swan, you realize, after what's happened, there's no place for you in my ward. I know you've got a little baby and all that, but Mr. John Pattison's son, Matthew, he won't forgive this theft. Especially since his father's operation was generally unsuccessful." Amanda stood with her head slumped. What could she say when she was accused of a heinous theft without proof? "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked wistfully. "Well, what to do? I'll get you a job, Swan. You'll have to go to the country for a while, of course. What else is there to do? Or you can return the bracelet and fall at the feet of those rich people. There's no other way. Do you realize that? And if you don't, you go to jail for robbery. The Pattisons don't take no offense." "Well, I don't have any bracelet," Amanda objected. But it didn't matter. The superintendent had already made up his mind. Why did she have to get her hands on it? "All right, Swan, I want you to go down to the accounts department and get that paperwork organized, and I'll give you the address to go to." The superintendent said goodbye, stroking the polygraph lovingly with the palm of his hand. Amanda nodded and walked out of the office. At that moment, she realized that her life would never be the same again. Everyone in the ward looked at the nurse as if she were a thief who had stolen an expensive bracelet from a patient, and this after she had worked here faithfully for 2 years. Tears came out of her eyes. In the billing department, everything went quickly. The cashier stamped her employment card with an impassive expression and pointed to the door. Amanda walked down the corridor as if in a dream. Helen, her partner, tried to stop her, to ask what was wrong, but Amanda just waved her away. She didn't want to talk to anyone right now, nor did she want to think about who was really to blame for the theft. When she stepped outside, she put her heated cheeks to the cool breeze and cried softly. Amanda walked home, clutching the bag of leftover lunch in her hand. As it happened, she was not going to be able to wait for lunch. Her heart was pounding in her chest like a bird in a cage. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving salty tracks on her shamefully burning skin. She still couldn't believe she'd been fired, and for such a flimsy excuse. Amanda was desperate. She loved her job, despite the hard physical work and constant stress. She walked down the street, trying to avoid passers-by as if they were involved in her accusation. The squeak of the polygraph and the phrase the superintendent had told her that morning, "You'll have to go to work in the province." What to do now? Fortunately, her son was waiting for her at home, the only happiness, a ray of light in this grim reality. Sam was only 7, but his cheerfulness and childlike spontaneity won over anyone who talked to him. Amanda, for her part, did her best to make sure that her son's smile never went out. She entered the flat, setting her purse and a bag of food on the floor. Sam was sitting at the table, diligently tracing some simple figure with a pencil. "Mom's here. I'm drawing a boat," the boy exclaimed with joy in his voice. Amanda sighed sadly and wiped her eyes with a handkerchief to hide her tears. Then she walked over to her son and hugged him, feeling his little arms around her neck. "What a clever boy you are," she said. Sam smiled and proudly showed his drawing. It was of a sailboat riding the stormy waves towards danger. Amanda struggled to squeeze out a smile, realizing that she needed to support her son in some way. But for some reason the words stuck in her throat, preventing her from saying the most important thing. How could she tell her son that his mom had been sacked and not only had been forced to pay up, but had also been accused of stealing something she hadn't committed? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Amanda cooked dinner, then watched TV with her son and put him to bed. Sam fell asleep quickly, not even aware of the impending trouble. It was understandable. A child, what could he do? Mrs. Swan sat in the kitchen chair for a long time, staring at the lights of the night city outside the window. She thought about her future life and the fact that she and Sam would soon have to move. In the pocket of her purse was a sheet of paper with the address Mr. Brown had given her. How would they be welcomed in their new place? What would await them? No one could tell. All through the night Amanda cried with her face buried in her pillow. Never before had she felt so helpless. The next day she got up at first light, feeling tired all over. She started preparing her son's breakfast, which consisted of an omelet and a couple of cheese sandwiches. Sam, as always, was optimistic and excited about the day ahead. At that moment the doorbell rang. Puzzled as to who it could be, Amanda went to open it. On the doorstep stood a woman dressed in characteristic formal attire. "Good morning, I'm Mrs. Emma Priestley, Chief Inspector of City Social Services," introduced herself. "Social Services?" Amanda stretched out uncertainly and let her in. "Quite right. You are Mrs. Amanda Swan, aren't you?" the inspector asked icily. She nodded dejectedly, realizing that nothing good was in store for her. She took Mrs. Priestley into the kitchen, poured her some tea, and set down a tin of sweets. The guest thanked her, and then came to the point. "You see, Mrs. Swan, since you are a single mother and you lost your job yesterday, our organization couldn't overlook that fact. I came to see if you needed any help." Amanda shuddered, mentally surprised at how quickly the information was spreading. She had only been sacked yesterday, and this morning an inspector was already on her doorstep. Was that really possible? Could it be that Mrs. Priestley had been given the right address to encourage Amanda to take more action? Meanwhile, the guest continued. "Mrs. Swan, in principle, the fact of your dismissal is not particularly negative. But theft, that's a serious matter. Such an unpleasant fact can lead to irreversible consequences, such as, for example, the deprivation of your parental rights. And in this case, your son Sam will automatically go to boarding school. And at best, you'd only see him at weekends. What am I supposed to do?" Amanda exclaimed in despair. Mrs. Priestley shook her head. "What am I to do?" The answer to that question, well, I don't know for sure, but I hope there is. They gave me this address just yesterday. They said they'd be waiting. Sam's eyes shone with joy, but Amanda didn't share that enthusiasm. To tell the truth, she still couldn't figure out who had set her up, who had stolen the bracelet from Pattison's room. Or maybe it all had something to do with the late rich man's will. After all, in fact, Amanda had heard his conversation with Notary Nicholas Wilson. But is that really grounds for dismissal? This is weird. Packing her bags, Amanda briefly fell into anxious reflection. She returned her thoughts to the day when Mr. Pattison had first had the notary in his room, and remembered how uncomfortable John had felt. He was weak, and only his burning, tireless thirst for life gave away the strong and strong-willed man in him. Amanda tried to clean herself so as not to disturb the patient, remaining invisible to others. It was an art. After all, not everyone knows how to remain inconspicuous in plain sight. The door opened, and on the threshold appeared a guest whom the sick businessman was very much waiting for. The notary Nicholas Wilson was a rather tall man with a gray streak in his hair. Amanda remembered well the moment when he entered, holding a bulky leather folder. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pattison," said the notary. noticing how the businessman, despite his weakness, visibly perked up at his appearance. "Nicholas, thank you for coming," said the patient. The notary sighed sadly and sat down on a chair by the bed, trying not to take too long. "Mr. Pattison, I am ready to draw up all the necessary documents." "Have you already decided who will be your heir?" The businessman wrinkled his nose and tried to assume a more comfortable position in bed. At this moment, the visitor, accustomed to handling the affairs of the rich, suddenly felt that the matter was taking an unusual turn. "Nicholas, I've been building my business for many years, collecting and saving money like bees save honey. And you know what I realized? It's all a load of rubbish, not worth a man's attention." The notary raised his eyebrows in surprise. John Pattison, a man whose name was synonymous with success and prosperity, talks about the uselessness of money. At this point, having involuntarily heard the details of the conversation, Amanda even held her breath in surprise. "I have a son, Matthew, who is not a bad boy, but I wouldn't want him to inherit my assets," the businessman continued. "What do you mean you wouldn't want him to?" "Who would inherit the assets?" "To his wife, I hope," Nicholas Wilson asked. Mr. Pattison sighed sadly and, as if addressing another, invisible interlocutor, added, "I'm tired of my son's family and antics, of his perpetual problems with the law. I'm tired of settling his problems with the police and paying for the repair of wrecked cars after accidents. You know, I don't have the energy for it. My wife Caroline is all over Matthew. He's not my own, he's my adopted son. So I want my fortune to go to help those who will really benefit from it: orphanages, homeless shelters." Nicholas Wilson, used to wealth being passed down from generation to generation, was shocked. In his years of extensive practice, he had never before encountered such a statement. "Mr. Pattison, this is a very responsible decision. Are you sure you don't want to leave the money to your son?" the notary asked. "I am sure. To Matthew, I would like to leave a good upbringing and a shake. I think it would serve him well," resolutely replied the sick man. Amanda nearly dropped the mop from her hands in surprise. Nicholas Wilson did not argue. "I understand and am ready to draw up all the necessary documents." At the same time, the notary realized that he was not just a rich businessman, but a man who had made a difficult choice that would probably change the fate of many. After the visitor had made the necessary edits to the will, Mr. Pattison said, "Nicholas, you and I are adults. We'll dispense with oaths and confessions, but please don't tell anyone about my decision. Let it be our secret." Nicholas Wilson nodded and involuntarily threw an anxious glance in Amanda's direction, but the businessman only waved his hand. "Come on, she's a lovely creature, a real cleanliness fairy. So don't look for problems where there are none." The notary nodded and began to fulfill his immediate duties. When Nicholas Wilson had finally finished drawing up the documents, he signed them and, holding out his hand to the businessman, said, "Mr. Pattison, very pleased that you have made this decision. I'm sure your financial assets will benefit those to whom they are addressed. And if you change your mind, I am always ready to help you and make any changes to your will." The patient shook his hand and closed his eyes. John felt that although he had met his illness face to face, there were still chances for a favorable outcome of the case, albeit small, but still. As it happened, Amanda had left the room a little before the notary, glancing at the bracelet that would soon play a cruel joke on her. And now, standing with 2 huge yellow suitcases in her hands, she still could not understand the motives of John Pattison, who had fallen into a coma after a botched operation. Couldn't he have left his son at least part of his business? And where had his bracelet disappeared to, which was the reason Amanda had been accused of stealing it in the first place? Sighing sadly, she looked round the walls of her rented flat one last time, and then went out to the stairwell with her son. There she gave her neighbor her keys and part of the rent for the last month. Behind Sam's back hung a funny backpack, from which the head of a teddy bear looked out. The boys saw the whole thing as an adventure. For Amanda, however, moving seemed to be something difficult and unpredictable. They decided to get to Orakovsky by bus, putting their bulky suitcases in the luggage. Amanda noticed with a smile that a young man had the exact same suitcase as theirs. Even the color was the same, yellow turning to orange. The cabin was stuffy. When the driver saw that Amanda was with child, he chose a better seat by the window, where he could get some fresh air. The sun, which was at its zenith, had already turned the bus into a red-hot furnace half an hour after the journey had started. Amanda looked longingly at the endless fields floating outside the window and felt sad. The yellow burnt grass was riddled with narrow paths that looked like the arteries of some huge creature. Sam sat next to her, staring at the screen of the smartphone his mother had bought him for his birthday. Amanda smiled, remembering the days when gadgets had never existed and people took books or magazines on their trips. Finally pulling away from the smartphone, Sam asked quietly, "Are there bears in the forest?" "I don't know, Sam. We are going to live in the village," Amanda replied. "What if a bear comes to the village?" his son persisted. "He won't come there. Calm down. Most of the time bears are afraid of human habitation and avoid it," replied Amanda. Meanwhile, the bus was traveling further and further away from the city. Fields, forests, and small bodies of water, which seemed like inverted saucers from outside, were passing by outside the window. The time on the road stretched very slowly. Finally, the bus slowed down smoothly and stopped next to an old, leaning on one side stop. "Oh, are we there?" Sam exclaimed and jumped up from his seat, following a couple of passengers who were hurrying to get out of the stuffy cabin. Amanda followed her son, unwittingly bumping the shoulder of the passenger, with whom she shared the same suitcase. The man smiled and nodded understandingly. "That's okay, it's fine." By the time Amanda got off the bus, the driver had already set her suitcases out on the sun-warmed tarmac. He winked at Sam and smiled at Amanda, genuinely regretting that he couldn't drop his early 20s and hit on this young mum. Fortunately, it wasn't a long walk to the village. Even so, Amanda had to stop at least 3 times to catch her breath. Still, as hard as it was, the suitcases were heavy on their own. And then there were the duffels, some crockery, and a few other small things. The village met the guests warily. The dogs, seeing the strangers, immediately began to bark. The geese hissed angrily, trying to grab Sam's leg. "I'm scared." Hiding behind Amanda's back, the son whispered, "Don't be afraid, they're just trying to get a rise out of you. They say we are the masters here, so we make our own rules." Amanda smiled and wagged her finger at one of the biggest geese. They walked for another 100 meters before Amanda saw a squat wooden building with a distinctive sign saying the paramedic station. Amanda smiled. "And this, son, is where I'm going to work." "Are you going to treat people here?" the boy asked uncertainly. "Well, not exactly like that. I'm not a doctor, but I'll help people when they're not well." "Well, let's go and get acquainted with my new place of work," Amanda suggested and headed for the door. The unlubricated hinges creaked softly. When they stepped inside, Amanda found the reception area small but cozy. There was a large old desk in the center, with a wooden chair lurking beside it. On the walls hung posters with medical illustrations and tables with various recommendations for patients. In the corner there was a small couch covered with a snow-white blanket. The room smelled of alcohol, iodine, and a peculiar odor that reminded Amanda of a hospital. "Hello," said a pleasant female voice behind her. Amanda and Sam, as if on cue, turned round and saw an older woman with kind blue eyes and blonde hair, gathered in a careless bundle. She was dressed in a distinctive white medical uniform that made her look like a doctor or paramedic. Come in. I'm Mrs. Mary," said the woman. Amanda introduced herself and her son. Well, Amanda, I take it you're the employee Mr. Andrew Brown was talking about? Mrs. Mary asked. Yes, I am, Amanda replied timidly, hoping sincerely that the superintendent had not told her about the theft. Mrs. Mary smiled. Well, if that's the case, then first of all, Amanda, you need to familiarize yourself with the basic rules and routine of the paramedic station. And of course, the basic disinfectants and medicines we have on hand. Amanda nodded in agreement. All right, let's do it. In the meantime, Sam can look at the pictures on the wall. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, even for children, Mrs. Mary added. The son looked at the colorful illustrations with interest. The next hour and a half flew by. Amanda familiarized herself with the documents and the basic rules. Mrs. Mary patiently explained to her everything she had to do within the walls of their paramedic station. Look, Amanda, you're going to have to be more of a nurse than an orderly for me here. So remember where everything is. There's green oil, also hydrogen peroxide, there's analgin, Corvalol. These are medicines that belong to the means of first necessity. Amanda diligently memorized everything. When you have some free time, you can flip through this book. It's a guide to emergency care. There's a lot of useful information in it, but for now you only need to memorize the basics. Mrs. Mary finished her briefing and said. Amanda took the book in her hands, realizing that she still had a lot to learn before she could become an indispensable assistant. Well, Amanda, is the job not scaring you so much anymore? Tell me, do you have any overalls, or should I get some from the warehouse? Mrs. Mary asked. No, I don't need any. I've got my own. I'm just going to get some now. Amanda replied and reached into her suitcase. Oh, what a case. I can tell you're here to get a job, not just do nothing. Thanks to Mr. Brown, your boss. I used to have him as an intern. Oh, that was a long time ago, the paramedic said with nostalgia in her voice. Meanwhile, Amanda unzipped the suitcase with an effort and gasped. Oh my God, it's someone else's stuff. What do you mean it's someone else's? Sam was alarmed. Mrs. Mary even came closer, interested in the news. Amanda's mind began to worry again. How would she find her own things now? And what to do with this luggage? Should she go to the police? What would she say? Open someone else's suitcase, searched it. That's not a very good prospect. And it doesn't feel right. No, the police are out for now. Especially since it's far from certain that this bracelet belongs to the owner of the suitcase. I mean, he could have found it on the street, for example. Amanda, are you in trouble? Tell me, is there anything I can do for you? Mrs. Mary asked with concern in her voice. No, thank you. I've already sorted it out. The bus driver just mixed up the suitcases and gave me and my son someone else's hand luggage. Amanda replied. She put the funeral wreath back. She noticed at once that it had a ribbon with a single phrase written in ornate handwriting with monograms at the ends to my beloved wife. From husband Michael. Then Amanda took the silver bracelet in her hands. It was as heavy and cold as stone. She felt a sudden urge to put it away before she got herself in trouble again. On the other hand, she couldn't take her eyes off him. It was hard to imagine a more beautiful and graceful piece, woven from silver threads like a delicate spider's web. It wrapped around its owner's wrist, pleasantly cooling his skin. The bracelet seemed to breathe, shimmering in the rays of light and playing with all shades of gray from pale, almost flesh-colored, to deep, almost black, depending on the time of day when it appeared before the eyes of the spectators. There could be no mistake, and Amanda understood that as well as anyone. This was the same bracelet that had nearly caused her to be prosecuted. Since there was nothing inside the suitcase that could help her find the owner, Amanda closed it, remembering to put the bracelet back. No matter how you look at it, you can't catch a thief. In fact, Amanda knew only that the owner of the suitcase was named Michael and his wife had died. But it was unlikely that this information could help her get on the stranger's trail. Deciding to leave the suitcase in the paramedics' warehouse, Amanda had to accept a white work uniform from Mrs. Mary. "Well, that's good, Amanda. Don't you worry about your things. They'll turn up, won't they? Now, I suggest you and Sam move into our staff house. It's not far away, almost next door," the paramedic said and headed for the door. Amanda smiled and followed, taking her own and the others' suitcases. Truth be told, she didn't feel sorry for the things at all. The point was something else, the truth. Had the owner of the suitcase stolen that bracelet? But why? For money. But he didn't look like a poor man. And in general, silver is much cheaper than gold. And from the sale of the bracelet could be a very small amount of money. But that's what life is all about. That's what Amanda thought as she followed her boss to her new apartment and dragged her suitcases with difficulty. Amanda stepped over the threshold of the old house. A faint light shone through the dust onto the white and green painted floors. The doorway was covered in cobwebs. The spiders that hid unhappily in the corner had long since grown accustomed to their power over this room. The house smelled damp and musty. The air was thick and heavy, which could be explained by the shuttered windows. "Wow! Are we going to live here?" Sam exclaimed. "Yeah, matey, what's wrong with it?" "But don't judge by appearances, they can be very deceiving," said Mrs. Mary, embarrassed. Amanda's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. She had come here to find a better life for herself and her son. No one forced her to do anything, so why be sad? Sam, tired from the long and difficult journey, touched her hand. "Where's our room?" he asked. "We'll see." Amanda reassured him, putting her arm around his shoulders. She then ran her hand along the dusty walls of the corridor, knowing full well that her palm would be dirty. There were only 3 rooms in the house. One was a tiny kitchen with a stove littered with smoldering pots and pans. And the other wooden shelves were filled with books and old yellowed photographs. But Amanda, with Mrs. Mary's prompting, stopped in front of the 3rd room, which was the largest and brightest of them all. It had 2 windows that gave an excellent view of the garden. True, they were shuttered now, but even that seemed a trifle unimportant. "This will be our room," Amanda said and smiled at her son. "Good choice, Amanda. Anyway, I'm sorry about the mess, but the house had been neglected for a long time. Well, make yourselves comfortable. I'm going back to the paramedic station, see if anyone needs any help." Mrs. Mary summed up and went out. Amanda nodded. Then she got down to business. As they say, the eyes are afraid, but the hands do the work. First, she scrubbed the floors and cleaned the window panes with a special solution. Then she reviewed the furniture, selecting from the pile of junk a whole and good one, so that their new home would be cozy again. Sam helped too, fetching water and even peeling potatoes for lunch, which she found in the house. By evening, the house was getting better and better. The walls shone with freshness and the shelves were cleaned of dust and plaque. The room smelled like home, and the sunlight shone through the clean windows in rainbow colors. Amanda looked proudly at the result of her work and smiled. Of course, the cleaning was far from over, and there was still a lot of work ahead of her. But at least now they had 2 clean rooms, the hall and the kitchen, where they could rest and eat respectively. Meanwhile, dusk was quietly falling over the village. Sam climbed onto the bed and looked with interest at the room that served as their bedroom and resting place at the same time. "Mum, is this place haunted?" the boy asked in a whisper, pointing his finger at a dark corner. Amanda smiled. "Of course it isn't. It's just an old house that can hold many stories within its walls." Sam nodded uncertainly and then immediately fell silent, mesmerized by the mystery of the room. As a loving mother, Mrs. Amanda Swan understood that at first it would be difficult for her son to get used to life in the village, especially to its silence and lack of entertainment. Finally, Sam settled down and closed his eyes. Mrs. Swan stood over her son for a few minutes longer, absorbed in her thoughts. Then, hearing his peaceful breathing, she quietly left the room and headed for the door. Night was slowly coming on. Mrs. Swan looked round. The moonlit courtyard seemed small but well kept. There was a wooden bench in the middle, and lilac bushes and a small bed of flowers around the edges. After enjoying the night scenery, Mrs. Swan returned to the house. She changed into her pajamas, washed her face, and locked the door for the night. Now she could go to bed with peace of mind. But what would happen tomorrow? No one knows. The morning is the morning, as they say. Mrs. Swan lay down on the bed and closed her eyes, feeling a pleasant fatigue spread through her body. Of course, as she fell into a restless sleep, Mrs. Swan had no idea that at that very moment, many miles away, her boss, Mr. Andrew Brown, was going through some of the most difficult moments of his life. There was silence in the intensive care unit, broken only by the sounds of the medical machines monitoring the patient's condition. The head of the surgical department stood by the bed where a man lay in a coma. Mr. Brown's face seemed tired, but his eyes remained clear and penetrating. At that moment, the events of the past few days flashed through his mind: the operation, the complications, the fight for the life of a wealthy patient. Mr. Brown understood that Mr. John Patterson's chances of recovery were slim. But on the other hand, no one knows what lies ahead. At that moment, a tall young man entered the ward, a hospital gown slung carelessly over his shoulders. The ward manager looked round and recognized the visitor at once. It was Matthew Patterson, Mr. John's son. Mr. Brown greeted him with a discreet nod. "How are you?" Matthew asked in lieu of greeting. Mr. Brown sighed sadly. "Your father's condition is still critical. He is in a coma." Matthew turned pale. "Doctor, tell me honestly, is there any hope of recovery?" The head of the department looked at him with an assessing gaze, as if trying to see into his soul. "Mr. Matthew, I can't make false hopes and promises. The chances of his recovery are slim, but we are doing everything we can." Matthew turned away, clenching the fingers of his hands into fists to the point of pain. "Doctor, is there any possibility that he may never come out of this state again? To put it simply, that my father will die because of your support, so to speak?" he asked. Mr. Brown frowned. "What are you talking about, Mr. Matthew? Don't forget yourself. This is not what I signed up for. It's one thing to sack a nurse who heard something she shouldn't have heard on a theft charge. It's another to make such a commitment. I'm not God to control people's fates. Besides, I took an oath as a doctor, in case you didn't know." Matthew hesitated. "But I really need my father to pass away. Because if he dies, I'll get the whole inheritance. I'm sure my father won't make it." At this point, Mr. Brown felt a pang of disgust for his guest. He was a surgeon and not a bad doctor on the whole, but for him to stain his hands with crime. "Mr. Matthew, I don't think we have anything more to talk about," said the superintendent. Matthew turned even paler. To tell the truth, he hadn't expected such a reaction. "Doctor, I beg you, please. I will give you part of the inheritance. Believe me, it was a lot of work to change my father's will and bribe the notary. But will you refuse to help me now when the inheritance is just around the corner?" With a strained voice, the young man blurted out. But the superintendent was adamant. Yes, he had dismissed Mrs. Swan so that she could not witness the original drafting of Mr. Patterson's will, the one in which the respected businessman wanted to leave his entire fortune to the orphanages. Little did they know that Matthew had gone to extraordinary lengths to persuade the notary to go along with the scam. Probably, if not for his daughter's problems, the lawyer would never have gone for it. But they say money works wonders. Gritting his teeth with anger, Matthew left the room, saying goodbye. Don't miscalculate like my father, doctor, or it'll be too late." Meanwhile, Mr. Brown was alone with his patient. He looked at the businessman's motionless body and tears glistened in his eyes. The aged doctor stubbornly failed to understand how a son, even an adopted one, could treat his parent in such a way. How could one wait for the death of a loved one for his own gain? Mr. Brown placed his hand on the patient's forehead. Then he looked at the machines monitoring the patient's condition. They were humming like a living organism. "It's all right. We'll fight you, Mr. Pattison," whispered the head of the department and left the room. Once again, he found himself regretting the dismissal of the nurse. But what could be done? When Matthew Pattison had cleverly trapped the eminent doctor in a gambling debt that had to be paid in a short time, the businessman's son had simply bought a receipt written by Mr. Brown from the creditors and blackmailed him. Mrs. Swan's fate was thus sealed. Naturally, no one stole the ill-fated bracelet that Mr. Pattison valued above all else. It was the lust for profit and Matthew's desire to rework his father's will. And Mrs. Swan had been the only witness to the preliminary announcement of Mr. Pattison's last will. Matthew was afraid that at one not-so-great moment she might speak up and put all his schemes in jeopardy. His mother, Caroline Pattison, had said, "Don't worry, son. Firstly, make inquiries about this person. What's going on? And then we'll decide what to do next." Matthew smiled. "Yes, I've been doing that for a while now. Anyway, single mom. Fiancé left her before her son was born. Parents are dead. She's struggling to get by. But according to her colleague Helen, she's very principled. She wouldn't collude." Caroline thought about it. "She wouldn't, you say? But then we have to go at it from the other side, accusations of theft. For starters, at least the bracelet your father wears without taking it off. Get her partner to do it, and we're good to go." Matthew smiled happily. "That's a good idea. What's with the bracelet? Why does he carry it around with him all the time? Silver's a cheap piece of jewelry. Oh, I wish it was gold." "I don't know. The answer to that question must be somewhere in John's past. He's a strange man. I never liked him. He's an idiot. But in my day, I just had no choice. You're a year old, your alcoholic husband left you with a lot of debts. And here's some bloke with a lot of money. So I took him on. And now we're dealing with it. I wish he'd get over it sooner. There's no life." Caroline replied with irritation. Matthew heeded his mother's words and did the right thing. He got an ally in the head of the department and bribed the notary. Then accused Mrs. Swan of stealing the bracelet that Helen had actually taken. Of course, the poor nurse didn't know all this and was... Together they built a sort of stretcher and carried the unfortunate woman to the paramedic station. "Mrs. Mary, help me out. I've got a tramp hiding in the barn. She's going into labor. And I've got this. My water's broken," said the farmer in a guilty tone. Seeing the stranger, the paramedic immediately changed in her face. "She needs to go to the district for a cesarean. And what a huge belly. Are there twins, beautiful?" she asked, addressing the woman in labor. "I don't know. My name is Emma. It could be 3, I don't know. I haven't had an ultrasound or registered. Oh God, it hurts. You've got to help me, for God's sake. What are you looking at?" The stranger was indignant. Amanda was astonished. To tell the truth, it was the first time she had ever seen such a thing. Feeling her abdomen with her hands, Mrs. Mary gave a curt command. "Amanda, call an ambulance. It's a multiple pregnancy. I don't know anything about this kind of thing." Amanda started to dial the number with a trembling hand, but the call kept dropping. The farmer and the tractor driver left immediately, as they could no longer hear the screams of the unfortunate woman in labor. Meanwhile, the bad weather outside the window had reached its peak. The lightning flashed so often that it made the eyes blurred. Thunder rumbled against her eardrums, causing Mrs. Amanda Swan to crouch in fear. The wind had also picked up, threatening to become a hurricane. The walls of the paramedic station groaned. They snapped like dry branches under a forester's boots. It was at that moment that Mrs. Amanda Swan realized they would never get help, especially after the dispatcher reported that the road towards the village was blocked by a huge, uprooted trunk of an old oak tree. God, what are we going to do now? Mrs. Amanda Swan sobbed and covered her face with her hands. What are we going to do? We'll try it ourselves, Mrs. Mary said over the noise of the storm. But it's one thing to say it, another to do it. Mrs. Amanda Swan felt in her heart that the paramedic had never experienced a pregnancy like this before. But there was nothing to be done. We can't just leave this woman to her fate. Come on, push, sweetheart. Mrs. Mary was stroking the woman's belly and saying. The woman screamed at the whole village. But it was no use. The local old ladies knelt down and began to recite prayers for God's help. But relief never came. The mother screamed, cried, scratched the sweat-soaked sheets with her fingernails. It was all in vain. Sweat trickled down Mrs. Mary's forehead and her lips trembled treacherously. She held the woman's hand, trying to make her feel better. Outside the window, a downpour of thunder and fierce gusts of wind was beginning to fall. At that moment, the door swung open. A drenched male figure appeared on the threshold. The wind shuddered. Amanda recognized the same passenger from the bus who had been the owner of the suitcase. Mrs. Mary froze in amazement as the guest commanded. Now, where do you have a place to wash your hands? I'm a surgeon from a private clinic. I was stopped on the motorway by some agitated farmer, shouting, "Hurry up, mate, help me, take me." Yeah, how am I supposed to drive him when there's a tree blocking the road? Mrs. Amanda Swan smiled and immediately helped him out of his windbreaker. So, is there anesthetic? The doctor asked again. Mrs. Mary nodded meekly. Putting the reins in the hands of professionals, everything that happened afterwards passed like a dream for Mrs. Amanda Swan. The moans of the woman in labor, the commands of the surgeon and paramedic, the cries of the babies, triplets, and no C-section. As it turned out a little later, Michael Knightley turned out to be a real professional and did without major surgical intervention. Taking from his hands one baby after another, Mrs. Amanda Swan cried and did not stop whispering some prayers. As they say, there are no unbelievers in such extreme situations. After about 40 minutes, it was all over. The woman, exhausted from labor, was fast asleep, and Mrs. Mary prepared dry baby formula from her own supplies. Mrs. Amanda Swan took turns feeding the babies from the bottle and exhaled a sigh of relief. Only now was she able to look into the eyes of her savior, to tell her that the bus driver had simply mixed up their suitcases that fateful day. Michael smiled. Yes, I realized that myself. I was on my way to see my wife at the cemetery. I didn't use the car. She was from a neighboring village. I thought I'd stay the night at her mother's. She's often ill. I bought a wreath, and this happened. Mrs. Amanda Swan lowered her eyes in embarrassment. She could not find the strength to ask the most disturbing question about the silver bracelet that was in one of the compartments of Michael's suitcase. Of course, she realized it was unlikely that such a man could be a thief, especially given his status and responsible job. But the truth was much simpler than Mrs. Amanda Swan had thought. The bracelet actually belonged to Michael's late wife, Mia, whose life was taken by an early stroke. She, on the other hand, had inherited the bracelet from her mother, Nadezhda, who lived in the neighboring village. Mrs. Amanda Swan listened and couldn't believe herself. So such a thing was not the only thing in nature? And at the same moment, unable to contain her emotions, Mrs. Amanda Swan cried and told Michael everything as it was. The surgeon listened in silence, only occasionally asking questions. Mrs. Amanda Swan, on the other hand, told him everything, both about her dismissal and about the mysterious bracelet. After listening to her rambling story, Michael thought for a moment, then said, "I think I can help you solve this case. Apparently, Mr. John Pattison was my Mia's father, so he made 2 bracelets, one for himself and one for her mum, Mrs. Kate." Amanda Swan shrugged uncertainly. "I still don't know what to say." Michael, on the other hand, didn't waste any time. After the storm was over, he called his mother-in-law. And that's when Mrs. Amanda Swan was in for another surprise. The mother-in-law confirmed the young surgeon's theories. Many years ago, John and Kate had met, made plans for the future together, but then they had to part. Through the fault of John himself, who had to go on a long business trip abroad. In farewell, he gave his bride a silver bracelet, made by a private jeweler in 2 copies. Unfortunately, after parting, feelings of lovers, as expected, came to naught. Here is only in memory of the connection with John. Kate had a daughter, Mia, who later married Surgeon Michael. In this case, Kate never once tried to find a former fiancé to tell him about the birth of a daughter. And now, thanks to her son-in-law, Mrs. Kate has such an opportunity. But only going to the ward, she decided not to talk about her daughter, so as not to reopen old wounds. Why aggravate his already poor condition? As it happened, Mr. John Pattison had been brought out of his coma with the help of the repentant head of surgery. And for his stepson Matthew, it meant only one thing: the end of all hopes and fantasies of inheritance. Shyly entering the ward, Mrs. Kate could not hold back her tears at the sight of the man she had once loved with all her heart. "Kate, darling, how could you do this? No warning. And I was about to die." The businessman stretched out guiltily, but the head of the department immediately pulled him back. "Don't even think about it. At the moment you are rapidly recovering, Mr. John Pattison, which means that everything is still ahead of you," said the doctor. The businessman smiled and got up from the bed and hugged his first love. At the same time, Mrs. Amanda Swan and Michael, who were standing in the room, tactfully turned away. Seizing the moment, the ward manager approached the former nurse and apologized. I'm sorry to you, Amanda. What's there to say? It's Helen. But the fact that I set you up and stole your bracelet, and then you went to the police and told them what happened. You got a guilty conscience? Amanda asked. Yeah, lucky me. They didn't prosecute me. They took into account, so to speak, the previous merits, a sincere confession. Anyway, they revoked the license of that corrupt notary. Matthew was called in for questioning. Only the fools run away, and they've put out an APB on him. They'll catch him. You come back if you want to. I'll take you in and give you a good place, and you'll get a minimum wage. The superintendent offered. Mrs. Amanda Swan smiled and shook her head. No, Mr. Brown, it's not for me. I'd rather be a paramedic at the station. In the village, that is. Especially as I've got a new addition to the family. What new addition? Have you had a baby, Amanda? You've got it. The superintendent marveled. But Mrs. Amanda Swan shook her head and Oh, these roses are gorgeous. What's the occasion for such a gorgeous bouquet? Grace asked. Is it for me? Or are we going to someone's house? You're a champion. Honey, I love you. Kieran held out roses to Grace. You know that, don't you? So without further ado, marry me. Grace waited for a moment for further developments. Then she raised her eyebrows and said disappointedly, Is that all? What do you mean? I don't understand, replied Kieran. Isn't that a marriage proposal? Silly. What do you mean? I want you to be my wife, to live a long and happy life together, to have children. I don't understand. Is that the best you can do? Grace asked unhappily. Where's the celebration? Where's the ring? You should at least look on the internet to see how men propose to girls. We'll go to a restaurant and celebrate, said Kieran. What about the ring? What about the video of you proposing? Grace, what's the big deal? We love each other, we want to get married. What's all the fuss? What's with all the hoopla? I'm a simple man. I'm just saying what I can say. I want a ring for your marriage proposal, said Grace, resentfully. Everyone will laugh at me when I tell them you proposed and didn't give me a ring. Grace let out a tear. God, I'll be embarrassed in front of the others. And even embarrassed. I'd be humiliated to the core. Who's going to ask you about the ring? Who needs it? Is it so fundamental? You have to have a ring and no other way. I just thought it would be better to use the money for a trip after the wedding. Kieran smiled and hugged Grace. That'll be the ring for you. You're crazy, she pushed him away, her tears drying in a flash. A wedding trip. You're clearly out of your mind. What haven't we seen? Hanging around in buses, swallowing dust, listening to tedious lectures from tour guides. What kind of wedding trip is that? It's horrible. Who would you tell about a honeymoon like that? We'd be laughed at, Grace said, indignantly. People go abroad and we're like idiots on some itinerary. We should go to Turkey as a last resort. Who's going to laugh? Kieran was getting nervous. Who cares about our lives? Grace, you're saying the wrong thing. Turkey can wait. We haven't seen anything here. And I don't want to see anything here, Grace said sharply. What's good here? Married. I want a good life, to be envied, not pitied. Well, don't all your friends get a ring and go abroad? I know some of them don't even have boyfriends and don't get married. Why do I have to settle for the worst? I want the best. Kieran. Grace laughed out of turn and hugged him. When should one want everything but when one is young? Later, when we are old and sick, we shall not want anything. But now I want it. I really want the ring, and Turkey, and the video. I'm afraid your demands don't match my possibilities, said Kieran sadly. What else do you want to know here on the shore? Or when we're going to set sail for the voyage of a lifetime? I'm afraid I can't give you what you want. I also want a home, our home, or home, where it's just you and me and our children, where there's no one else, no parents, no grandparents. Just you and me, Grace said. I wanted this to be a surprise to you, Kieran smiled. I'll tell you. You and I are going to have a house like this, or rather we already have one. My grandmother will move in with my mom and dad, and we'll move into her house. My grandmother gave me a gift. She gave me a deed to her house. Can you believe it, Grace? Grace looked at her husband to be satisfied face. The smile slipped from her face, and from the expression on her face, Kieran realized that the surprise had failed. What kind of house is this? Grace said with a tone that tolerated no objection. It's a 60s Khrushchevka. My idea of a house is at least 2 stories, floor-to-ceiling windows, underfloor heating. And I walk barefoot on the warm floor. Look through these windows and enjoy this house. This is home. Grace, your dreams are unrealistic, Kieran objected. Other people live in apartments all their lives. They don't have a place to live and don't expect to. We have a whole house, 4 rooms, a kitchen, a veranda. We can add a bathroom. Why should we add new old things to old things? It is old, Grace said. And then, I told you before, why should we look up to those who are doing worse than we are? We have to reach for the best, strive for it, and then everything will work out. I'm sure of it. You'll see, Kieran. Everything will work out and we'll have everything. You just have to want it badly enough. I see that potential in you. Otherwise, I wouldn't have chosen you and loved you. I will always, I will always be there for you and support you because I love you so much. I love you so much. Let's start over. Do what again? Kieran didn't understand. I accept the bouquet. It's not going anywhere. Flowers don't last forever. and you properly organize a marriage proposal. Get ready. Buy a ring, but make sure it's a diamond. Even if it's small, it has to be a diamond. Book a restaurant, invite your friends, have a professional video shoot, maybe some fireworks, you know, the whole thing. Grace, I don't like the whole staged thing. It just feels so fake to me. I'll feel like a clown. Love is a two-person feeling. It likes silence, not fireworks. And I really, really want it all. For me, for my lovely future wife. Can you make it happen? I need it, Kieran. She looked ingratiatingly into his eyes and asked, Please, Kieran. Kieran once again tried to convince Grace that this was an unpleasant situation for him. Grace, here you keep saying that you want to be envied. Why would you do that? Because everyone knows that envy is a bad thing, both for the person who's envious and the person who's envious. You know, I feel good when I'm envied. It makes me feel so euphoric, so energized. So sweet, Grace replied. Naughty. She laughed. That's the kind of wife you're going to have, Kieran. Not vicious, but determined. I look envious men in the eye and taunt them with my superiority over them, the wretches. Grace, you are also a great sinner, said Kieran, putting his arms around her and kissing her. Then he looked intently into her eyes, which were burning with a passion he did not know, and said, Pride in you is overflowing, and this is a great sin. But I love you, I love you. Since when are you such a believer? Grace asked quietly. Well, it's all right. It's the way it should be. Different poles attract. You and I are so different. I'm the devil by your standards. You're an angel. And we're drawn to each other. That's love, Kieran, Grace whispered in his ear, her voice husky. He recognized that intonation when her voice became unreal, with an altered timbre. It meant she was aroused and wanted him. I love you like this. Yes, darling, yes, Grace whispered. That's what love is, and love justifies everything. Grace had everything she wanted: a marriage proposal, a party, a ring, a noisy company, a video shoot, and even fireworks. And most importantly, she saw the envy in her friend's eyes, unconcealed envy. And from that, as she thought, the holiday was a success. This is how she will go through life, so that everyone envies her and burst from this envy. And Kieran, although he has his own opinion, Grace knows how to tame him and direct him in the right direction. In spite of everyone, she will be happy, and she and Kieran will have everything they want. They just have to want it badly enough. The wedding of Kieran and Grace also thundered on a large scale, accompanied by noisy fun and videotaping. Afterwards, they visited Turkey, realizing their wish at her behest. Such noisy festivities were not in keeping with Kieran's character. He was very tired. Very tired. Even a vacation in Turkey had not done him any good. He was glad it was time to go to work. Grace's energy kept him on his toes. Maybe those who live together before marriage are right. At least they could figure out if they could live together. Or were they so different that living together was impossible? Kieran loved Grace very much, so he could not propose an unofficial marriage to her. He felt he would humiliate her with this proposal. He thought Grace deserved to be a real, legal wife. So a little old-fashioned, or rather, not modern at all, was Kieran. And all because of the way he'd been brought up. Both grandmother and mom and dad were educated, cultured people, and always resented the relationship between a guy and a girl like try to live together, and then already in register marriage. Mother, and especially grandmother, could not understand how these cohabitants had already had 2 children, and still could not make up their minds whether to get married or to try further. That's why such relationships were taboo for Kieran. But now, yes, he's very tired of Grace. I think with the money we have left after the vacation, we should make some cosmetic repairs in the house, said Kieran, when he and Grace moved into the house of his grandmother. Not at all, Grace replied emphatically. I don't see the point of such an investment. We should build the new house we want behind this house. And then this one should be demolished, Kieran grinned. Who are we? Do you know how much money is needed for such a dream? We don't have that much money. And we don't know if we will have it. We need more than the crumbs we have left from the gift money to start building. It starts small, Grace said confidently. We'll get a loan from the bank and we'll build. Not invest in this old place, but build a house from scratch that will really be ours. Unrealistic, said Kieran. I don't earn enough to get into bank debt. They'll find you another job. We'll cover the loan with our main salary and live on our part-time jobs. And your salary? It won't be part of our family budget? Kieran asked. Well, Kieran, how could you ask me that? I didn't expect that from you. Grace laughed, switching to a joking tone. I am a woman. I have my own needs. I need money for them too. So my salary will be used for those proverbial pins. And then the house and the lot are yours alone. What's the point of me investing in it? We'll build the house together. What if I get thrown overboard? Grace, what are you thinking? We just got married. What about me? It's life, Kieran. Life and realities. And unfortunately, that's what they are. When you get divorced, you take what's yours. But I didn't get married to get divorced. Grace, listen to me. We don't need a new house. We can fix this one up. And 4 rooms, stone walls. It'll last us a lifetime. You're talking like an old man for our lifetime. Kieran, we live in a different century with all the benefits and innovations. Why should we live in the old way? Don't you realize how great it is to live in a smart house where everything is automated? Come on, Kieran, don't be shy. You're a man. And as you know, a man should build a house, raise a son, and plant a tree. I'll help you with the son and the tree, and you build a house. Be a man, said Grace. Let's not put off finding a job for you. I'll get right on it. You see how strong my ambition is. I'm willing to help you in any way I can, to support you. You can count on me. Tomorrow we'll go to the bank and find out what's going on. I've sketched the house. Look at this. Look at the gorgeous house we're gonna have. Grace opened her laptop, called Kieran, and smiling in anticipation of surprising her husband, said, Come on, come here, look. There's too much information, there's too much of everything, and there's too much of you, Kieran wanted to say. And we won't go to the bank tomorrow. We've got to think about it. While you're thinking, the dollar will rise. You've got to think fast. This is the age of quick decisions. The bolder the better. Or, if I understand correctly, are you going to live in this barn for the rest of your life? No, Kieran, I don't believe I was wrong about you. You're smart, you're determined, and you're a man. That's how I saw you when I married you. Come here, come here. Kieran reluctantly walked over to his wife and sat down beside her. He was looking at his laptop, listening, but he couldn't hear Grace. He was tired, very tired. Son, are you all right? Ciaran was asked by Ciara's mom. I look at you, you are not like the newlyweds, frowning, tired. Things not going well with you and Grace. I'm fine, Mom. I'm just really tired. I've been working a lot. You know, Grace and I are going to build a new house. I've been working part-time, telecommuting. Honestly, I'm not getting enough sleep. Kieran, would you say I'm meddling? But son, you've got to understand, your health is more important than a new house. You'll have a house, but your health will be gone forever. Sick people are not happy about anything, not even new houses. It's your decision to build a house. It's my and Grace's decision, Kieran replied. My boy Ciara hugged her son and stroked his shoulder. If you can't afford to build a house, you shouldn't tear yourself up like that. Sick, tired husbands are not necessary for people like Grace. Kieran answered his mother sharply. Don't I don't want to hear it. Don't say anything bad about Grace to me. She is my wife. Ciara sighed. A wife takes care of her husband, not pulls the life out of him. I can see everything, son. I have eyes and ears. You've been too hasty with Grace, son. She needs another man, a man like her. Why did you raise me like this? Kieran asked, and putting his arms around his mother's neck like a child, he cried. I'm weak, mother, weak. No, Kieran, you're not weak. The mother stroked her son's head. You're not a pushover. You're not a bore or a scoundrel or a peddler. I don't know. Maybe in this day and age that's a disadvantage rather than an advantage. Your father and I raised you to be a decent man, and we're proud of you. And Grace needs a man with qualities that you don't have. A man who will go over your head and do whatever it takes to get what he wants. If you want to build the house Grace is claiming with your hard-earned money, you're gonna kill yourself, son. Mom, but I love Grace. She's pregnant. We're having a baby, and I promised her this house. I can't not keep my word. This is where I regret raising you to be a man of your word. Can't you build a smaller house? Grace designed it herself, shows it off to everyone, brags about it, and that's why you can't back down. Ciara sighed heavily and said, I have a serious talk for you, son. Come on, I'll feed you. We can talk about it. Mom, thanks, I'm not hungry. No, Kieran, you've lost weight. What's wrong with that? Come on. Ciara took her son under her arm and they went into the kitchen. It's delicious as always, Kieran smiled after the meal. Now we'll talk. You think better on a full stomach, smiled his mother. Have you taken a loan from the bank yet? No, not yet. We're going this week. Grace and Kieran sat in the kitchen with Ciara. Granny's got some money too, said Ciara. We can lend it to you on your own recognizance. When you can, and if you can pay it back. Then why the receipt? Don't you trust me, mother? Kieran was surprised. The receipt. Let it be a document for Grace. I know how unpredictable she is. I told you not to speak ill of Grace, Kieran frowned. Did I say anything bad? You're just in the wrong sled. Son, Ciara sighed. Oh, Kieran, it's great that we don't have to go to the bank, Grace said brightly. Listen, since we have money to build a house, why don't we buy me a car on credit? Why? Do you have a second job? We can afford it. My belly's gonna grow soon. Where will I go with it on the shuttle buses? And then the baby comes, how am I supposed to carry it? Wait, Grace, Kieran stopped her. The money for the house came with conditions. What conditions? Grace asked unhappily. Well, for one thing, it's a loan. Here's a receipt notarized by a notary. And secondly, on the condition that I'll work only at my main job, I'll give up my part-time job. And we won't say you're moonlighting, Grace smiled conspiratorially. But if we don't, who's going to know? Grace, honey, I want a car so badly. I can't even imagine driving to work. Everyone would be jealous, she laughed. I'm not buying you a car. I feel sorry for people. Don't let anyone die. Let them live, Kieran tried to turn the conversation into a joking mode. Kieran, please, please. A car for a woman is a necessity, Grace whimpered. Grace. I don't know if it's jealousy or work that's going to kill me. Is that what you want? Kieran answered his wife seriously. Can't you see I'm having a hard time? I sleep for 3 hours, I get up at 6, and then the money is on loan. I have to pay it back from every paycheck. I'll cover the debt. What do you mean, on credit? They're your parents. Won't they forgive you for this money? They gave us all their money, Grace persisted. Do you understand that? Kieran asked. Do you really think I'd leave my parents without money? I don't know, Grace shrugged. Other parents forgive. And then they won't even have time to save for retirement. They're past their youth. They don't have a lot of wishes. They could have sacrificed that much money for their own son. Grace smiled and pouted like a child. Do you really want your wife to work her ass off on the buses? Mom was right, Kieran thought. That's why she had the debt notarized. Grace's needs not everyone can handle. Look, Grace, ask your parents for money for a car. Kieran dared to say. His wife's demands were starting to piss him off. I'll tell you right away, I'll give up my part-time job. Don't even think about it. I'm not able to work nights. Do you hear yourself? Grace was indignant. I have a husband, and I'm going to beg my parents for money for a car. Kieran, have you humiliated yourself like this? Kieran was silent. He realized that no matter what he said, Grace would have only her own opinion, and it was the right one. I'll quit my second job, I'll pay off my parents' debt, I'll keep building the house. I'm not counting on a car. And that's my final answer, Kieran reported to his wife. And now I have to sleep, and how do you want to sleep? How can you talk to me like that? I'm pregnant, and you're getting on my nerves. Grace burst into tears. Who's getting on whose nerves? Stop crying, kitten. Kieran hugged his wife. Let's go to bed, and you think about what I'm asking of you. Wine? A car is a necessity for a woman and not a whim. A lot of promises that you'll think about it. Don't get your hopes up. You know I keep my word, and I'm keeping it this time, Grace persisted. She realized that after going to her parents, even though I forget. Oh, don't be angry. Won't you do me this little favor? My motherly whim. You're so angry that I'm afraid to admit to you my little wish. What else? Kieran asked unhappily. I hope it's not a dream of a yacht. Oh, I'll be braver now. Because what I have acquired is such a trifle compared to a yacht. Kieran looked at her fearfully. Come on. I'll show you my little girl. Grace took her husband's hand and led him out of the gate. A red car was parked outside their house. How was it? It's a lot cheaper than a yacht, kitty. Honey, I'm so happy. Even though I'm on maternity leave, I'll drive my baby to work tomorrow. They're gonna die of jealousy. Can you imagine their faces? Grace talked and talked, and he couldn't hear her words out of shock. Just a high, skinny voice, like a pesky fly. Come on, I'll show you. You'll see how great it is, Grace chirped and tugged Kieran's hand. You've already taken me for a ride, Kieran said, emphasizing the word already. He pulled his hand out of his wife's and asked what money was used to buy this baby. He had never spoken so rudely to Grace before, but here he could not bear it. He couldn't help himself. Are you out of your mind? We're building a house. I was against the car. Why don't you listen to me? You only hear yourself. Sometimes I think you're insane. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she threw a violent tantrum. Kieran didn't want to see the tantrum and thus encourage it. He did not rush to comfort her. He turned around and went home. He waited for her to show up, but she wasn't. Kieran got worried and went outside. Neither Grace nor the car was there. Where was she? Where had she gone? The distraught pregnant woman got behind the wheel and sped off. Where would he look for her? He called her cell phone. The calls came in, but she didn't answer. His head split in two with worry. He began to get headaches very often. It had never happened before. But once he got married, it became a frequent occurrence. Kieran went into the house, took his medicine, made another call, and heard Grace's cell phone in her bag lying on the couch. He called Grace's parents, but she wasn't there, and her friends didn't have her either. She got home late, close to midnight, and as if nothing had happened, she rattled on. Kotik. You can't imagine how everyone sighed with envy when they saw my little girl. I'm in a wonderful mood, even though you're mad at me. No one's going to ruin my happiness. So Kitty, no need to get upset and get on each other's nerves. It's done. Kieran was silent. He was so nervous that his headache wouldn't let go. You feel good when others feel bad. Vampire was all Kieran could say. Yes, I'm your little vampire, Grace adopted a playful tone. And now I'm going to bite you, and then I'm going to kiss you. She threw herself around Kieran's neck, but he pulled her away from him. I can't see you. I can't. Go away nicely. Where would I go, Kieran? I'm your wife. And as you know, husband and wife are the same Satan. And then we'll have a son. Satan is you, Kieran said. I'm beginning to realize that we've rushed into marriage. You and I are different, you know. I think I'll have to put up with you and your delusions all my life. I'm getting a headache. I'm sorry, Kieran, Grace cried. I know it must be hard for you, but it's only at first. It's like that for everyone, until you get used to each other. And then they get used to it and become one. Understand, my dear man. Love is not for everyone. And I love you so much. I can't do it without you. I can't. Where did you get the money for the car? Kieran interrupted Grace's passionate speech. I'm talking about love, you're talking about money. So which one of us is the mercenary? I asked you a question. How hard is it to answer without all the waterworks? Just answer. I bought it on credit. I made the down payment with the money you were saving for your parents. Grace stopped talking. I suppose you'd better not know where the money is, said Kieran. You'll be on maternity leave with the baby. How are you going to pay off the loan? It's not that much money, though. The car isn't cheap. I think we'll be able to pay it off in no time. Who's we? IA. Grace grinned. We were plowing, said the fly that sat on the ox's horns. Well, you're the fly, the annoying fly that's bothering me, and I want to swat it in one fell swoop to be free of it. Don't do that, Kieran stopped himself. I promise it won't happen again. Believe me, we'll have a child, your son and mine. We'll have a new home. Imagine how happy we'll be. We'll come to each other. You'll see how great it will be. Now, if he had any money, Kieran kept it only on his card. The PIN number, known only to him, was unknown to Grace. He knew it was dangerous to keep money in the house without consulting him. Grace instantly found a use for it. For a time, Grace ceased her frenetic activity about the ideas and prospects she was creating for her husband. A child was born in Los Angeles, and she was fully immersed in motherhood, which pleased Kieran very much. Grace was probably right. Kieran thought it would take time for them to get used to each other. 6 months had passed since the birth of baby Vader, and Grace had resumed her efforts in the area of perfecting her family. She realized that their house was being built, and it was her credit. She had insisted on such a beautiful, comfortable, modern home. She had bought herself a car, it is true, against Kieran's wishes, but how comfortable she is now. And then it was her dream come true, too. Kieran took a break from her ideas. Time to get back into work, Grace thought. Otherwise, if her husband isn't pushed to exploits, the mire of a frustrated bog awaits him. There needs to be movement. Movement is life. I will not let Kieran die in this quagmire. I will push him forward, encourage him. We'll get to such heights, everyone will gasp and die of envy. Kieran, have you thought about changing jobs? Grace asked. You can't stay in the same rut with a steady paycheck. I think a man needs development to move up, to feel on top of things. Somehow, Kieran, you've accepted your average salary, your status as a manager. If you see that the job is unpromising, Is it worth holding on to it? I see your potential and I think you're capable of more. I'm happy with the job, Kieran replied. And then Grace. It's not easy to find a high-paying job in this town. This isn't Los Angeles. The rates are different here. And I think I have a pretty good job and the pay is pretty good. Not bad, Grace repeated, as if tasting the word. She was silent for a moment, as if giving Kieran time to consider the term. And then she said, not bad means nothing. Kieran, you're 31 years old, and you have a pretty good job with a pretty good salary. And at the moment you have a lot of debt, and you're willing to put up with it. Is that how I see it? What do you want from me? Kieran sighed. I'll tell you right away, I won't be able to work nights. I've been having these headaches lately. I'm not happy about the white light, so I realize that night work won't do me any good. Who said anything about night work? Grace was outraged. I'm talking about changing jobs. You know what I mean, Kieran? You know it's impossible to get a high-paying job without connections. And you can count on me. You want me to find you a job like that. But where would you find it? Grace, don't be ridiculous on the internet. Kieran grinned. No, not like that, she said. I'm not stupid enough to look for a prestigious job on the internet. I still have some connections from the past. I can build bridges and try to find you something more worthy of your intelligence and your knowledge. How would you feel about that? Grace, did you have such a past? Kieran wondered. Were you what? Am I jealous of your past? Grace laughed. Well, that's silly. Didn't you have one before me? And then I worked for this big company and I was in good standing. That's all it was. Why did you leave such a great company? I'm afraid you wouldn't believe it, Grace hesitated, or you'd take it the wrong way, so I'd rather not talk about it. But I'd like to know what pitfalls to expect if you're going to put me in there. Okay, Grace sighed. Just promise not to jump to conclusions. Listen. My boss's wife was jealous of me for him, but not of the boss himself, but of the head of the department I worked in. That's funny, Kieran snorted. But you couldn't prove your innocence? I wasn't going to prove it, it's beyond me, Grace said. I just quit, that's all. And you want people to say behind my back that I'm the husband of the woman who was having an affair with the boss. I knew it, Grace said sharply. I didn't, and haven't been hooking up with anyone. And you're a man. Are you afraid of some idle gossip? It's ridiculous. Kieran, if you're a man, you should be afraid of small wages, low ranks, and poverty, not gossip. We have a son growing up. He needs a good kindergarten, not a bunch of snotty kids where he'll always be sick, but a real elite one. Then you are not going to give him to a simple high school, where they raise drug addicts and alcoholics for the future of the country. Grace kept coming at him. The kid should be in a school with good kids from good families, not with the rabble where he's going to become the same rabble. Grace, you're making it worse, Kieran objected. I went to high school and, as you can see, I didn't become a rabble. Don't compare, Grace said. It's a different time. The worthy join the worthy. And the trash? She didn't finish. She stood up abruptly and went into the other room. Then she stopped at the door, turned around and said, think about all this at your leisure. In a word, I'm right. And you know it. When you've thought it over, you'll say. The dream house was built, and Kieran's family moved in. Kieran, it's time to tear down that shed that's such an eyesore, Grace said. We'll plant roses and weed the lawn and all that. I'll go out to the kitchen in the morning and look at the beauty of it. It'll make me thirsty. This shed prevents me from realizing my plans to transform the landscape around the house. It's going to take a lot of money to demolish the house. And your landscape, too, Kieran shook his head. So my solution is not to demolish the house, but to renovate it with the money that would have gone into demolishing it. I can't demolish the house my grandparents built. You're crazy. Grace gasped. You've made up your mind? Did you ask me? Do you ask me when you've made up your mind? Was the wedding according to your plan? Did you plan the vacation? Did you design the house? I bought the car on my own. Did you ask me? Are you going to do this for the rest of your life? I'm going to have this barn and this car in my face. Grace was torn up with emotion. I wanted what was best. I wanted our child to walk and play on the lawn, not bump into that shed. Shut up. Kieran couldn't help himself. And don't call the house where my parents were born a barn. There's no telling how things will turn out. Maybe someone else will have to live in this house. I could use the extra room. It would prevent me from being completely happy. Grace took a breath. I didn't envision our home that way, and this shed is a hindrance to that. Kieran glanced at his wife, and she stopped talking. And you know, Kieran, people will come to the housewarming party and be surprised by this wreck in the middle of the yard. The old house steals the impression of the new. I don't think anyone's going to be jealous to see that wretched thing in the yard. It's a good thing they won't. They'll sleep better. Kieran interrupted her rudely. You don't think they will this time? Accept it. And even your tears won't make me back down. After the quarrel, Grace did not speak to her husband for a week. She hoped to get what she wanted by keeping quiet. But she realized Kieran wasn't that simple. Once he'd said something, he was unlikely to change his mind. But that's all right, she'll get her way in other ways. Grace, as a hostess, was proud of her brainchild and showed the guests the possibilities of the smart house. Despite the old house in the backyard, everyone admired the new home. But she didn't invite guests just to show off. She had her own plans for them. She decided to tear down the old house with their hands to get their support. Well, it certainly worked out the way Kieran and I wanted it to, Grace said at the party table. But Kieran doesn't want to tear down the old house. He thinks it's appropriate here. Personally, I don't think so. So I'd like to get some outside opinions. Do you think there's a need for an old hut next to this magnificent house? Hearing such unpleasant words about her house, Grandma was saddened. She lowered her head and smoothed the folds of her skirt. She cried furtively, quickly wiping away her tears with her handkerchief so no one would notice. Kieran's mother put her arms around his grandmother and pulled her close. Kieran saw all of this. He was ashamed of his wife's words in front of his grandmother and in front of his parents. Of course, a lot of people had come to the housewarming party, and he didn't want to find out about it. He didn't want to spoil the holiday for those who came to enjoy their new home and have fun. I wouldn't tear the house down either, said Ivan, Kieran's friend. I would renovate it, make it into an extra living space. No one could use the extra living space. On the contrary, many at the table supported Ivan, which upset Grace very much. She realized she had lost this time. If it weren't for my parents and my grandmother, this house wouldn't exist, said Kieran. Let's drink to their health, he said to the guests. My loved ones, my dear ones, thank you for everything. Kieran went to his mother, father, and grandmother and kissed them. What about me? Don't I get a thank you? Grace said resentfully. If it wasn't for me. Of course, everyone heard the indignation of the mistress of the house, but realized that it was not worth focusing on her offended words. Everyone supported the toast. The guests made praised toasts in honor of the hosts. The guests cheered, and Grace did not feel her triumph. She was not envious of the people who had come to the housewarming party. They just shared the joy, cheered, and for some reason praised Kieran and his parents, but not her. She was the one who had built the house thanks to her kicking, and his parents' money had been given not for nothing, but as a loan. Why were you pouting all evening? Kieran asked his wife. Well, it's not proper to invite people and sit like a mouse on the croup. He hugged her, kissed her on the temple. My little mouse, look, you'll burst. Kieran wanted to cheer up his wife. So all smart and clever, all honored, all participants in the construction of the house. I'm the only one on the side. Grace was indignant. And why didn't you say that your beloved grandmother, Daddy and Mommy gave you the money on credit? Why did you sing such dithyrambs to them? Didn't you know that? If we had borrowed the money from the bank, the interest would have cost us another house, Kieran explained. Grace, you know all about that. And then my parents forgave me half of the money and gave it to my grandmother to rebuild the house. Oh, so that's it. I'm nobody here, and my name is nobody. And that's the last I'll know, Grace said, indignantly. I only found out about it today. My dad told me about it, that it was their housewarming gift to us. Kieran changed his tone. Grace, well, since we don't have to pay off the debt, let's hire a housekeeper. Look how big the house is, how much cleaning there is, especially today after the guests so many dishes to wash. You have a dishwasher, said Kieran. But you have to get the dishes ready before it. I don't think I can do it alone. Why did you have to build such a big house? Convenience, Grace said sharply. Convenience. What's the point of hiring a housekeeper? And then you haven't even gone to work yet. Can't you handle it? Of course I can't. There's house after house after house, and that old house of yours. I'm prioritizing the baby. I told you I could call you about a job that pays twice your salary. A good one. You don't say anything, so you're okay with the pittance you get. And we have to suffer because our breadwinner is happy with a good salary. I get it, said Kieran. Because no one was jealous of you today, you decided to take out your anger on me. You know what I'll tell you? This house was built because I loved you, and I promised it to you. Or rather, you made me promise you. I was building it. And I already knew it then. We didn't understand each other, and we never will. No matter what kind of house we live in, happiness doesn't depend on the wall. Honestly, I hate this house. Everything revolves around it. Where are we? Grace? Where are we? Is the house more important than our feelings? With this house and your crazy ideas, we've lost everything we had. 4 years we lived with you. We built a house, and that's it. We have no common ground, Grace sighed. So while we were building the house, we had something in common, and now we don't. Isn't our baby Vincent a common ground? Grace, we dreamed of this house. We dreamed of how happy we'd be to live in it, Kieran said. You were the one who dreamed of it. I was just the doer. I don't want to stay in this house. I have a terrible headache from your arguments, your frustrations, and your irritation. I'm going to sleep at Grandma's house. Is that what you're going to keep it for? To run away from me? Kieran didn't respond to his wife's words, only shut the door tightly behind him. Grace went into the kitchen. She didn't want to look out of the windows at that hut on chicken legs. For the first time in their 4 years together, Kieran had not slept with her, had defiantly gone to that hovel she hated. No, she doesn't want that kind of strife. First, he will not lie in the marital bed. Then he will find himself a mistress. And then, perhaps, will wish to divorce her. That's something she can't let happen. She can't find a man like Kieran. She's not so stupid, she realizes that. Besides, where would she go in the event of a divorce? Her parents? No. By any means necessary, she'll still be the mistress of this magnificent house. Kieran's not exactly a star in the sky, but he does his best for his family. And that's the kind of husband you'll find. And then a father is better than a stepfather for her child. Kieran loves Vincent very much, but you can't play on his love for a child for long. You've got to be more subtle. Kieran didn't go into the new house. Grace watched from the window as he left for work, and for the first time they didn't have breakfast together, so he's still angry with her. And by the looks of it, there'd be more fighting tonight. She had to get the house in order, cook something nice for dinner after the guests, and be sure to have candles to make it intimate and romantic. Grace decided that she needed to clean herself up too, so that Kieran could see who he was trying to make a deal with. What's a wife like her to look for? And the fact that she was pushing him to some small victories. So it was again only a plus for her. Without her initiative, they would live in this shack with paper wallpaper. Grace didn't like the fact that Kieran was stubborn, unwilling to take the high-paying job. She'd already made inquiries, got her ex-lover involved. There's a place, but they won't wait long. We need to get Kieran and push him into a position that would bring them good money. Of course, the work there is nervous. The state constantly allocates money for government contracts, so there are frequent inspections, audits, where auditors pick on every comma. Not everyone can withstand such nervous tension. Despite high salaries, people often quit. That's why it's possible to get Kieran a job there. Kieran, don't do that again. I was up all night. I'm used to having you with me at night. I was scared. I wanted to call you, but I was afraid you'd start fighting with me again. I know you're tired. The guest had been drinking, so he got a little hasty. Maybe I'm wrong about something, but you're wrong too, honey. No matter how much we fight, we should sleep together. I didn't sleep all night either, said Kieran. Kieran realized that he had been up all night and had a terrible headache. I want to sleep, he said. I have a headache. Where are the medicines? I don't know where they are in this house yet. Peace. Sweet peace. Grace looked into her husband's eyes and said, You're going to see how great things are going to be with you and me. You won't regret that we didn't get divorced. I said, I have a headache. Give me a pill. This time there was no danger of divorce. Grace saw that Kieran was determined to break up, but fell for her threat to kill herself. So he was scared. And that's good for her. She'll know how to manipulate her husband. It's time for Grace to come back to work from maternity leave. So she decides to use one more trick on her husband. She's going to try to squeeze him after all. He'll take the job she got him. Although, I'm not going back to my old job. I quit. What's wrong with your job? No new people to envy you, Kieran grinned. I know you meant it as a joke, to poke fun at me. But it's not about envy. Someone in our family has to earn money if he won't take that responsibility. I have to provide for my family. I'll get a job, I can hire a housekeeper. I won't have time to take care of the house. I have to put the baby in a high-end daycare center. I'm not putting Vincent in a breeding ground for infections. And I need money for that too. Did you get a job like that? Where do they pay the money you're going to use to do all this? Kieran asked with a grin. Yes, I did, Grace replied calmly. That's where you don't want to go. I'll go to my lover, Kieran said angrily. Why your lover? I explained the situation to you. No one there was my lover. And then I am a married woman. What claims can there be against me? I have a family, a child. I put that above all gossip. That's when I took offense and left. And now I have grown out of these petty grudges so I can go to work there again. Grace continued. But I'll tell you right away, it's hard work. And no one gets paid money for nothing. Sometimes, and on weekends are loaded. Sometimes you have to work late, irregular working hours. In short, it's all spelled out in the labor contract. I tell you about all this at once, so that then there were no claims against me. Why did you decide this on your own? And you're just putting me on the spot. It's a family matter, so we have to decide it together, Kieran answered calmly. We are, Grace replied. But you've left me no choice. Someone has to take financial responsibility for the family. Is this your way of pushing me into this job? Is that what I'm offering you right now? I realize it's not your thing. It's useless to hold you accountable. So I'll go myself. Well, go, said Kieran. When you go out, most likely in a week you have to quit your old job and then. Kieran didn't talk about the subject again. And Grace had said all she wanted to say. She hadn't expected Kieran to say that. She'd have to do the work herself. If she gave up the idea, Kieran would realize that it was just scaremongering, manipulation. So he won't take her threats seriously. She would not want to meet with those who witnessed that shameful scandal when the wife of her lover came straight to the department, grabbed her by the hair, and hit her head against the table where she was sitting. She hit it with such force that a lump formed on her forehead and her nose bled. "If I ever see you at this table again," said the scandalized woman, "I will beat your bad head against the table until this table falls apart." Such shame and such scandal. Grace didn't know where to put her eyes from the gloating of those around her, so she couldn't take it anymore and quit. Now would she have to see all those faces again? Grace heard that Kieran had learned all the tricks. I guess this conversation had touched him after all. He was thinking, after all, she was glad of her husband's concern. It means she's not hopeless and she's on the right track. "Kieran, darling, can I give you a lift to work today?" Grace said at breakfast. "We'll go to my old job. I have to hand in my resignation letter. We'd better hurry. A good job won't wait long. As soon as it's available, it'll be taken. So take advantage of my kindness." Grace smiled and poked Kieran on the cheek. "I'll make it quick. You won't be late?" "Don't worry." "Wait, Grace, before you quit." Grace looked at her husband questioningly. "Can you wait for 2 days?" Kieran asked. "Why?" "I don't get it, Grace." "Wait for what, Kieran?" "To wait for the seat I'm counting on to be filled. Miss out and regret it." "No, Kieran, I can't take that risk. Eugene promised me a spot. Maybe it'll work out. And if it doesn't, Eugene won't help me, and I'll lose the job." "No, Kieran, they gave me a week to do everything. That place Eugene's promising, is the pay really good?" Grace asked with doubt in her voice. "Yes, it's good, 1.5 times my salary, but it'll have to wait. But if Eugene doesn't work out, then I'll take that job of yours. You're afraid of gossip. What if Eugene doesn't work out, and you don't think I'll have time to register?" "I can't take that risk, Kieran. It's not every day you get a job like this. I give you my word, I'll go if it doesn't work out with Eugene. If Grace, you know, if I've given my word, it's my word. It's my word. So you don't have to worry. Vincent's going to have a high-end daycare center." "Thank you, darling." Grace rushed over to kiss Kieran. "Once again, I was convinced I'd chosen the right husband. How lucky I am to have you. Right here, Kieran. It scares me when people envy me what a wonderful husband I have." Grace was afraid of jinxing the situation. Knowing Kieran, she still hoped that he would take financial responsibility for the family. Would he really be satisfied with a salary less than hers? Grace would certainly be happy for Eugene to find Kieran a job. According to Kieran, the pay there is even higher than what Grace was promised. And then there's no malcontents there who'd want to tell Kieran the truth. "I don't care about them, let them talk." She'd get out of it. Kieran would believe her, not these envious people who did nothing but envy her. Eugene couldn't get a job for Kieran, so having given his word to his wife, Kieran had to go to work where Grace had gotten a bad name. He didn't realize that he would find out the details of his wife's liaisons with her boss and the other employees of that business so quickly. It wasn't that he'd been deliberately inquiring. It had all spilled out on its own. Kieran even liked the work interesting, promising, and he gave himself to it completely, for which he received a decent salary and even bonuses. No, of course, not immediately he found out about everything. He worked quietly until some personalities did not realize that he was the husband of the very Grace, who, seeking the best place for herself, jumped from one bed to another. It turns out that she boldly took advantage of men who promoted her career. And then she did not squander the attention of customers with whom she worked, and for the good of the company traveled to foreign resorts with these customers. It was a shock to Kieran. Who was he living with? A whore. That's why she's pulling his heart out. She's used to living the high life, and he, a simple guy, fell naively into the clutches of a predator. Grace had never seen Kieran so drunk. He couldn't speak a word. She could tell from his rambling speech that he'd found out. She didn't care what he'd been told. The next day, when Kieran sobered up, she would refute all these rumors and gossip. After all, who would he believe, her or those who had once envied her? Her, of course. She's his wife. And then there's the whole pre-marriage thing. As Kieran's wife, she never cheated on him. Overhearing the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law, Maria Petrovna was numb. She heard such a thing, she gathered. "Albert, we can't go on like this," Linda exclaimed indignantly. "How much longer are we going to be crammed into this tiny room? The baby's coming, and we don't even have a place to put the cot. What can I do?" Albert didn't even turn round, still staring at the monitor. "You know, we can't take out a mortgage. We need money for a down payment. And because of your whims, we can't save up any money. Let's move in with your parents. They have a bigger flat than this one, 2 rooms, but separate. And the kitchen is bigger. Linda. And your mummy will live here alone like a queen. Besides, you know my daddy's very sick. He needs peace and quiet. Besides, he and my mum live in separate rooms. And you're suggesting we put them in the same room? They'd fight all the time. Mummy likes to watch soap operas all day and Daddy hates them. No, I'm not going to let my parents be bullied." "Yeah," Albert nodded. "So you can bully my mum?" He raised his voice. "She already doesn't know where to get away from your eternal discontent. She only comes into the kitchen when you're not home. And she's the landlady, not you." "So live with your mum," Linda cried. "I'll go away. And when the baby is born, I'll raise it myself. And you won't even see it." "Linda, calm down," Albert hugged his wife. "You mustn't worry. I'll think of something. Just be patient." Amelia sat on the sofa in the next room and listened to the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law. "What can you think of?" She sighed heavily. "Albert works all day long as it is. Even on Saturdays he is not at home. His salary is small, he can't afford a flat. I can understand Linda too. She wants to be the boss of her own flat. And here I am, an old woman, disturbing them." She lay down on the sofa and closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but sleep did not come to her. But memories came back to her mind. Amelia had raised Albert alone, without a husband. As it happened, she was unattractive, tall, thin. And she didn't dress fashionably. What man would pay attention to such a thing? She came to the city from the country. She entered a school for painters and plasterers, lived in a dormitory. And after graduation, she got a job in a construction organization, from which she got a small room in a communal flat. She worked on weekends, went to the village, helped her mother to take care of the vegetable garden. Her mother called her back home, but Amelia refused. "I don't want to go back to the village. There's nothing to do here, and it's not interesting," she said. "You can't go back to your parents' house." Her mother chastised her. "You should have looked for a bloke here. You'd get married, and then you'd have kids. But you live in your town like an old woman. You'll end up like an old maid. You're nearly 30 years old, and you've never even had a man, have you?" Amelia resented her mother and promised she wouldn't visit her for a long time after such talk. But on Saturday, she took the bus back to her home village. She had no friends in the city, and those with whom she was friends were married, had children, and were busy with their own worries. The only thing left was to spend all her weekends in the village. And on Monday morning, the first bus back to the city. It was on this bus that she met Nicholas, who was returning from the wedding of an army friend. He helped her carry the heavy bag of potatoes and pickles her mother had packed to the house where she lived, and suggested that they meet the next day. Amelia was hesitant at first, but then agreed. She liked Nicholas for his courtesy and his easy, cheerful disposition. At work all day, she thought about what she would wear on her first date and decided to wear a dark blue skirt and a white jumper. She didn't have anything else in her wardrobe. "You look like you're dressed for a party meeting," Nicholas joked when he saw Amelia. All right, no offense. It was a joke." "Well, why don't we not go to the cinema, but take a walk in the park?" Amelia suggested. She was afraid to stay with Nicholas in the dark, even in the cinema, which was full of people. "Well, in the park." So in the park, he took her by the hand. "Can I buy you an ice cream?" he asked. When he saw that the girl shook her head negatively, he shrugged again. They walked leisurely along the park alley and talked. Or rather, Nicholas spoke alone, and Amelia listened to him attentively and laughed at his jokes. "Once a young lieutenant was sent to our unit," Nicholas said with a laugh. "As soon as I saw him, I was stunned. It turned out to be Austin. He and I lived in the same house, even went to the same school. Only he was a few years younger. I was in my second year of service, soon to be discharged." So Nicholas lit a cigarette. "I met a girl at that time, even you could say. We had an affair. All my leave was spent with her. And it was a young business. I wanted to see her more often. But you can't go, oh, Walla Patrol will stop you at once. Yes, they can put you in the brig, and then you won't be able to see her at all. So that's what I came up with. I started asking Austin for his lieutenant's uniform. Officers' uniforms didn't stop patrols in the city, so they could move around freely. Took me a long time to convince him that countrymen should help each other out, that sort of thing. And I did, because when Austin was on holiday, I'd put on his uniform and go out on the town. I did it once, I did it again. And the third time I came back to the unit, I ran into my own Oliver. How surprised he was to see me wearing my lieutenant's epaulettes. I never went on leave again for the rest of my tour." "What did they do to Austin? Did they punish him too?" Amelia asked anxiously. "No," Nicholas waved his hand. "I didn't give him away. He said he'd borrowed the uniform, and from whom I do not know." From Nicholas's story, Amelia learned that he lived in a hostel and worked at the factory as a milling machine operator. He has never been married and has no plans to marry. "It's too early for me to have a family," he said, and lit another cigarette. "I look at my friends who have already got married. So it's a deadly bore. And if you get a bad wife, it's a disaster. My maid Ashley, he's rushing home after work. I say to him, 'Ashley, let's have a beer.' Take the edge off, and he tells me that if his wife smells alcohol, she'll make a scene, and from his body for a week." "And what about the children?" Amelia wondered. "Don't you want to be a father already?" "Children?" Nicholas grinned. "I never wanted to have them. It's a lot of trouble. First you have to get up at night, then take them to daycare, then do homework with them, and how much money is spent on them. And in the end, you don't know what your son or daughter will grow up to be. Our foreman Michael's son went downhill. Got mixed up with a bad crowd. Almost ended up in juvie. What's he got to look forward to? Father's a respectable man, mother's a librarian, and the kid grows up to be a thug. Maybe he lacked parental attention." Amelia suggested. "The son has shoes, clothes. What kind of attention is needed?" Nicholas objected. "Nobody took care of me when I was a kid either. My father died early. My mother worked 2 jobs to feed me and my sister. And nothing. I grew up a decent man. I work, and I send money to my mother." Amelia didn't answer, though she disagreed with Nicholas about family and children. Perhaps he doesn't realize yet that children are a great happiness, she thought. How can one not love them? They walked round the park some more, and Nicholas walked Amelia home. He didn't ask her out again, and Amelia decided that she didn't like Nicholas, and he didn't want to continue hanging out with her anymore. She was surprised to see Nicholas sitting on a bench outside her driveway a few days later on her way home from work. Oh, Amelia was embarrassed, adjusting the dress she'd been wearing that day. I didn't even expect to see you again. Maybe we should go for a walk, Nicholas suggested, getting up from the bench. The weather's so nice. Amelia nodded her head in agreement, and they walked towards the small square. She was very embarrassed by her appearance, but Nicholas didn't seem to mind. He was joking again, talking ironically about his friends, and not asking Amelia about anything. Yes, she had nothing to tell about herself. She lived in the village, studied, now she works. That's all. Would anyone be interested in that? At the entrance, Nicholas suggested that Amelia meet at the weekend and still go to the cinema for an interesting film that had recently been released. Once again, Amelia agreed. She was very pleased that a guy like Nicholas was paying attention to her. So they started dating. And 2 months later, Nicholas stayed in her room for a sleepover. Amelia did not want to invite him to the flat, but he was persistent, saying that he would only have a cup of tea and go to his dormitory. How they ended up in the same bed, Amelia didn't exactly realize. Nicholas's kisses were so sweet that she felt as if she had lost her head. "So I'm your first man?" Nicholas asked in surprise. "I didn't expect it. Why didn't you tell me right away? I would have been more gentle with you." Amelia didn't say anything. She was ashamed. She sat on the bed with her legs tucked under her and the blanket covering her. "Why are you so scared, you silly girl?" Nicholas tried to touch Amelia, but she recoiled. "You should have had your baby a long time ago. And you've been walking around?" He swore foully. "Well, I'm going to go. It's getting late. They might not let me into the dormitory. We're strict about that." After seeing Nicholas off, Amelia went back to her room and couldn't sleep until morning, remembering what had happened between them. "I don't even know what he'll think of me now," Amelia worried. "And he'll refuse to date me since I'm so easily available." But Nicholas began to visit her 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes they went to the cinema, but more often Amelia fed him dinner, and then they went to bed, and Nicholas stayed with her all night. "I wish I could marry him," Amelia looked fondly at the sleeping Nicholas. "Why, he's a hard-working bloke, and the fact that he drinks a lot of beer is no big deal. That's why he's a man. And who doesn't drink nowadays?" Amelia closed her eyes and imagined herself in a white wedding dress and long veil. As she and Nicholas walked out of the registry office, he picks her up in his arms and twirls her round and round, and Amelia laughed happily. She rarely visited her mother in the village. "No time. We have a lot of work," Amelia justified. "I've gone to work at the factory. I'll become an apprentice." "True, my room had to be returned, and I had to move to a dormitory. But they say that they give flats to the front runners of production. So I'm trying my best. I want so much to have a separate place where I would be a mistress." "It's time for you to get married. That's what my mother said admonishingly. You are getting on in years. Are you going to stay a maiden?" "I will not." Amelia lowered her eyes. She hadn't told her mother about Nicholas yet, although they had been dating for a year. When they moved into the dormitory, they didn't see each other as often as before. Only when her roommate Jessie worked a different shift or went to her family for the weekend, Nicholas would come to Amelia's house and stay until the morning. But lately he'd been coming less and less often. Amelia waited for him, heating dinner, and then cried into her pillow. One day on her day off, Amelia had breakfast with her roommate Jessie. She had cooked a delicious scrambled egg and was now happily eating it, helping with a slice of bread. Amelia had barely brought her fork to her mouth when she felt dizzy and barely made it to the toilet. "What's the matter with you?" Jessie asked in surprise. "Are you pregnant?" "I'm not." Amelia smiled strangely. "I must have been poisoned yesterday. I bought a pie on the street. I thought it looked suspicious. Yeah, Jessie grinned. My mom's been pregnant 5 times and she used to say the same thing. For milk, for pies. You should go to a woman's doctor and get yourself checked out. Don't tell me you've never been with a bloke. I found cigarette butts in my room more than once. So you brought him here while I was away. Amelia blushed up to her ears and skewed her lower lip. You think it was me? There's no way anyone could have come into the room. Go to the clinic. Jessie continued to insist. It won't be too late. You can have an abortion before it's too late. What are you going to do with a child now? No flat, no mother to help you. All right. Amelia nodded her head. To calm you down, I'll go to the doctor, then we'll laugh together. But there was no laughing. Amelia was indeed pregnant. She came out of the antenatal clinic and didn't know what to do next. Sitting down on a bench, Amelia thought, we should tell Nicholas everything. As it happens, he has to marry me now. He's not going to give up his own child. She cheered up, got up from the bench, and went home. Waiting until the weekend, when Jeezy was away at her parents' house, Amelia waited for Nicholas to tell him that he was going to be a father. Nicholas was late that day and didn't arrive until the evening drunk. A friend had a son, he told Amelia from the doorstep, so we had a little celebration. He came into the room and sat down on a chair. He already had 2 daughters, but Scott just wanted a son. A son is a son. Nicholas held up his index finger. An heir. What would you do if you knew you were going to have a son soon? Amelia asked cautiously. Nicholas hesitated. The devil knows. He put his foot on his leg. Never thought about it. And if you think about it? Amelia looked at him slyly. Well, I suppose I'd be glad, Nicholas said uncertainly. Why do you ask such questions? Well, then rejoice. Amelia clapped her hands. I'm pregnant, and I'm sure that we'll have a boy. Stop. I'm not going to kill my baby. Amelia covered her still flat belly with her hands. I'll raise it myself alone, and we don't need no daddy. She buried her head in the pillow again and cried even louder. Yes, it's a mess, sighed Jeezy. What are you going to tell your mother? I thought you said she was strict. Aha, Amelia exclaimed. I'll have to tell her. She wouldn't kill her own daughter. Besides, she'd just been dreaming of grandchildren. The next weekend, Amelia went to the village. Mrs. Anna shook her head. I haven't heard a word from you for 2 months. Come on, get dressed and go to the garden. You can help dig potatoes. Amelia dug potatoes, but refused to take the buckets full of them into the cellar. What's the matter? Mrs. Anna was angry. The town has spoiled you so much that you can't help your mother. I shouldn't be lifting weights right now. Amelia lowered her eyes. The doctor said not to. Is something wrong? Are you ill? Mrs. Anna looked at her daughter anxiously. What did the doctor say? Mom, I'm pregnant. Amelia, after a moment's silence, blurted out at the top of her lungs and backed away, afraid her mother would hit her with a spade. Yes, said Mrs. Anna. It's a long way off. If there's a hole, there'll be a hole. Who's the father? Do you know him well? Amelia dodged the question. Well, we met. Mrs. Anna rubbed her lower back. Come next weekend. I'll heat the sauna, set the table. Come on. The future son-in-law can butter me up. He can bring me a glass of water in my old age. It's only my child. Amelia lowered her head. I will bring him up alone. Said Mrs. Anna. I've lost my maiden honor and forgotten it. Have you thought how I'll look in people's eyes? They'll say Amelia Robinson's a girl in an interesting position. What a shame. Mrs. Anna was indignant. What do you think I should do?" "Do what?" Amelia took a couple of steps back again. "Give birth, of course. I'm not getting rid of the baby, and I don't care if they point the finger at me." "What can I do with you now?" Mrs. Anna sighed. "The girl's not old enough. Maybe a child will brighten your loneliness." In the evening, they sat at the table for a long time, discussing how to live their lives and what would be best for the unborn baby. They decided that Amelia would stay in town so that there would be no cause for rumors in the village. And it was better to give birth there. The doctors were close by. She'll also go to the trade union and push for a separate flat. Like a single mom. Mrs. Anna will sell all the animals, close the house, and move in with her daughter to help with the baby. Amelia will go to work because she has to earn money. There's no one else to help. And Mrs. Ann will look after her grandson and run the household. Just a month before the birth, Amelia moved into a small one-room flat, and soon Mrs. Anna arrived from the village. At the due date, Amelia gave birth to a son, whom she named Albert. When in the maternity hospital she was brought her son for the first time and pressed him to her breast, she immediately realized that this boy was the meaning of her life. 3 months later, Amelia went to work. For some reason, she had no milk, and the pediatrician advised her to switch the boy to formula feeding. Because of this, Amelia was very worried about not being able to feed her son herself. She wanted to give her child the best, so she did not refuse any overtime, sometimes working 2 shifts in a row at the machine. The foreman turned a blind eye to this. For him, the main thing was to fulfill the plan. Mrs. Anna finally settled in the city. Only she wouldn't sell her house in the village. When Albert grows up, she said, "We'll go to the village for the whole summer." Let the boy Albert breathe fresh air. 2 years later, the factory gave Amelia a small 2-room flat with a pass-through room and a small kitchen. But Amelia and her mother were happy about it. "Albert will go to school, and he'll have his own room," Mrs. Anna said proudly. "And you and me, my daughter, will share a room. And if you have to get married, I won't get in your way. I'll go back to the village." No, Amelia shook her head. "I'm not going to get married. What if a father who isn't my own starts hurting my little boy? And what do I need a husband for? It's only trouble." After a while, Mrs. Anna suddenly began to complain of pain in her heart, although she had no problems with it before. And her blood pressure was constantly rising, and no medication helped. Doctors helplessly waved their hands and advised to change the climate for a while. After consulting Amelia, Mrs. Anna decided to go to her village for a couple of months to live in peace and quiet, not in the hustle and bustle of the city. Albert was already in kindergarten, and Amelia had to transfer to another shop to work only the day shift. In the village, Mrs. Anna came alive, even managed to make a few beds. In the vegetable garden, carrots and turnips, vitamins for Albert, she said. One morning, a neighbor came to her house, brought a can of steamed milk, and saw Mrs. Anna lying on the floor. The neighbor started calling for help, but it was too late. Mrs. Anna had been dead for a couple of hours. Amelia took a long time to get over her mother's death and blamed herself for letting the sick woman go alone to the village. But life went on. In addition, Albert demanded attention, and Amelia's heartache at losing her mother began to subside a little. Soon she sold her parents' house in the village. With this money, she made some repairs in the flat and renewed the furniture in the room of her son, who was soon to go to the 1st grade. Again, Amelia worked hard. In addition to her main job at the factory, in the evening she washed the entrances to the house. She needed money, which she spent without regret on her son Albert. He had everything he wanted: an expensive football, toys, table hockey. Amelia tried to make sure that the boy, who was growing up without a father, did not need anything. When returning from work, Amelia always went to the shop and bought Albert sweets. She bought fruit for him exclusively at the market, as well as cottage cheese, meat, and fish. There were times when wages were delayed at the factory and there was only money left in her purse for traveling. Even then, Amelia managed to feed her son something tasty, inventing her own recipes and using what she could find in the fridge. She herself might not eat it all these days, or she would wait for what Albert left on his plate. The most important thing for her was that her son never went hungry. She looked at her son fondly when he ate, and she didn't even worry that she would be left without lunch at work tomorrow. She did her best malnutrition, lack of sleep. She was very tired, working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs. But she never complained because she did it all for the sake of her favorite son, Albert. Albert himself did not cause his mother much trouble. He studied well at school, played sports, and attended an aeromodeling club. Amelia was proud of her son and blushed with embarrassment when he was praised at parents' meetings for participating in sports events or helping to clean up the school grounds. When he was in high school, Albert began to work part-time himself, cleaning entrances to help his mother. He was shy, but he never refused to unload goods in a shop or help someone carry heavy things. He always used the proceeds to buy his mother her favorite Palanca sponge cake, or they would go to an ice cream parlor together and Albert would pay for it himself, proudly taking the money out of his pocket. Amelia was happy to have such an attentive and caring son, telling everyone she knew about him. After graduating from high school, Albert enrolled at the Polytechnic University. He wanted to apply to a construction technical school, but his mother Amelia insisted that he must have a higher education, which no one in their family had ever had. After classes, Albert worked part-time again, either as a loader in a warehouse or as a waiter in a cafe. Amelia now did not clean the entrances, and at the factory she moved to the receiving department, because after a long time working at the machine, her legs were very sore. All in all, they were doing well. The only thing that upset Amelia was that Albert would not introduce her to any girl and did not want to marry her. And Amelia wanted to have grandchildren. "Mum, why should I get married?" he said, laughing. "I'm fine as I am. Who else will take care of me like you? And I have nothing to offer a girl my own flat, no car too. And I don't make much money yet. Not many people would go for that. But you're handsome and clever." Amelia looked at her son with love. "The rest is a matter of time. What do you need a flat for? You can live here. There's plenty of room for everyone. And when I die, you'll be the masters of the whole place." "No, Mum, I don't want to." Albert shook his head. "You and I are good together." After the institute, Albert got a job. From time to time, he met one girl or the other, but he did not start any serious relationships. Everything changed when he met Linda, a tall, blue-eyed beauty with long blonde hair. They met at a birthday party at a mutual friend's house and left together. Albert walked the girl to her house, agreeing that they would see each other again in a few days. Linda was 4 years younger than Albert, had also graduated from university and worked as a marketer in a trading company. She talked interestingly about the countries she had traveled to and her work. Linda was so light and cheerful that she literally turned Albert's head. They had already been dating for 6 months, when Albert decided to introduce Linda to his mother. "Mum, I've finally met the girl of my dreams and I want you to meet her," he announced one evening. "Oh, son, I'm so glad." Amelia splashed her hands. "We must set the table. I'll bake pies with cabbage and potatoes as you like. What is your girlfriend like?" "Linda doesn't eat anything sweet or flowery," Albert grinned. "She's on a diet to keep her figure. So don't cook anything. We'll just have tea. I'll buy a low-fat cake myself." "It's not very human," Amelia shrugged. "A new person comes into the house, and we can't even give them a proper meal." "Don't worry, Mum." Albert put his arm round Amelia's shoulders. "The main thing for me is that you like each other." "I'll like any girl you like, son." Amelia stroked her son's head. "The main thing is that she loves you, and you love her too. I want you to be happy." But no matter what Amelia said, she didn't like Linda. "She's a tricky one," she said to herself as Albert left to walk Linda home. She smiles sweetly, but her eyes are evil. Oh, this new fashion. A slice of cake and a cup of tea, that's all the treat. But it was evident that Albert loved her, and that was important. "I'll get used to her somehow," Amelia decided. "My grandmother used to say a hen pecking at a grain. She keeps the whole yard in her memory." "Mum, what do you think of Linda?" Albert asked excitedly when he got home. "Isn't she beautiful?" "She's beautiful," Amelia agreed, nodding her head. "But she's very thin. What keeps her soul alive? Do you love her?" "Very much." Albert averted his eyes in embarrassment. "And I want her to be my wife." "Now it's time for you to marry," Amelia smiled. "Well, son, so be it." They decided to have the wedding in 3 months, so that they would have time to prepare for it. Albert told Linda at once that they would live with his mum. "You see, Linda," he said, "we have no extra money for rented accommodation. We'll have to spend a lot of money on the wedding. And I've already bought the honeymoon vouchers. In the meantime, we'll live with my mum in a separate room, save money for the down payment, and take a mortgage on the flat. My mum's very nice. I think you'll get along with her." "Of course, my love," Linda replied gently. "You're absolutely right. Why pay money to strangers when you have somewhere to live? We'll be patient for a while, but then we'll move into a bigger and more spacious flat." Linda answered in a way that made Albert like her even more. She had not thought about a future life with her mother-in-law. She knew the saying, "Patience and hard work will get you through it." The wedding was celebrated in a restaurant. The bride's parents insisted on it. Amelia was uncomfortable. She had never been to such a place. Every now and then she was adjusting the new dress she had bought for the celebration. And when she sat down at the table, she took off her shoes with a small heel, which stung, but were very beautiful and matched the dress. Through tears, she looked at her grown son in his dark blue suit and white flower in his buttonhole. She was proud that she alone had managed to raise such a handsome boy, who might soon become a father himself. And she, Amelia, would have long awaited grandchildren. Linda was also very pretty. In a snow-white long dress, she looked like a porcelain statue. The guests kept shouting. Bitter, the bride and groom rose from their seats and kissed embarrassedly. "And I've never had a wedding. And I've never worn a white dress either," Amelia suddenly thought. But she immediately dismissed the thought. What's there to be jealous of? She was angry with herself. You should be happy. My only son is getting married. My pride and support in my old age. The bride's parents said that the wedding should be celebrated in half. "We realize, of course, that you're on a tight budget," Miranda said when they met Amelia before the wedding. "We're not rich either, but we do value our only children, so we don't have to make a mess of it in front of the guests." Amelia didn't know what rich people were and tried to object. "We don't have many guests on our side. No relatives. Albert will invite a few of his mates from school and work. That's all." "It doesn't matter," Miranda said. "Just be thankful we're not making you buy the bride's outfit. Like we used to? Believe me, it's not cheap." Laura picked out a dress at the salon for her. She named the cost of the dress, a price that made Amelia gasp. "Well," Miranda continued, "we're not going to skimp on our own daughter. A wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Well, maybe 2, she thought. 3 at the most. So we need the bride to be the most beautiful." Amelia withdrew all the money from her book, which wasn't much. "The bottom shelf in the fridge is yours. Put your food there, and we'll put it on the middle and top shelves. We'll eat separately because I'm on a diet. I'm cooking everything low-fat. It's time for Albert to start thinking about his health." Linda brought some nice crockery from her parents, pots and pans, a small frying pan. There was only room for Amelia in one narrow cupboard, 2 pots, a couple of plates, a cup, and a few other kitchen utensils. Linda packed everything else into a large bag and took it to the rubbish bin. "Why do you keep all this stuff?" She was indignant again. Gold-rimmed mugs, 3 plates, bent spoons. Who needs it? "My mother brought it from the village," she answered timidly. "How could I get rid of it?" "There are so many beautiful sets for sale." Linda sighed. "And you can't get rid of a rustic." Linda continued to tidy up the flat, which had been literally transformed. In her and Albert's room, there was a new sofa and a small wardrobe. There were blinds on the windows and a plasma TV on the wall opposite the sofa. In the bathroom, Albert had installed shelves on which stood jars of creams, shampoo, and other feminine products that Amelia didn't understand. "Son," she asked Albert when Linda wasn't home, "did you get a bonus or something? If you bought such a marvelous thing," she pointed to the automatic washing machine. "It must be expensive." "Mum," Albert laughed. "Now you can buy everything on credit." "What do you mean?" Amelia looked at her son in bewilderment. "It's like this: first you buy a thing, and then you pay for it gradually," Albert explained. "Everybody lives like that nowadays, and you don't have to save up for years to buy something you need. I'm planning to buy a car that way too, and I'm paying off the TV here, and then I'll take out a new loan. Unless Linda needs a fur coat," he laughed. "When do you plan to have children?" Amelia asked Albert. Later," Albert said. "We want to live for ourselves first, to see the world. And it will be difficult to do that with children. We'll have to spend a lot of money on nappies and nappy covers." Sometimes Linda's friends came to visit. They'd sit in the kitchen for long periods of time, smoking. It gave Amelia a headache and she couldn't sleep all night. But she didn't say anything to her son or daughter-in-law. What are the young ones to do? Old age will come, and you won't want to socialize with anyone. Twice a year, Linda and Albert went on holiday. And then Amelia felt like a full-fledged mistress in the flat. She could sit at the table in the kitchen for long periods of time, watch television, cook leisurely, standing at the cooker. And most importantly, she enjoyed the silence. No one walked back and forth across her room, and she could sleep well at night. When Amelia retired a few years later, it became even more difficult to live in the flat. Linda wasn't working by then either. She had quit her old job and was looking for a new one. But she was in no hurry to get a new job. But she was always reproaching Albert for not earning enough money. Linda slept until lunchtime, during which time Amelia had time to eat breakfast and prepare her own food so that she would not disturb her daughter-in-law in the kitchen. Linda liked to sit at the table for a long time with one foot on the chair, take her time drinking coffee, smoking 1 or 2 cigarettes, and looking out of the window somewhere in the distance. Amelia tried to get out of the house by this time, whatever the weather. Amelia would walk down the street, going into shops to keep warm or to hide from the rain. She would return towards evening when Albert came home from work. She felt more at ease with him. Late at night, when they went to their room and switched on the television, Amelia couldn't sleep well, waking up to any noise, Albert going to the toilet, Linda needing to get a glass of water from the kitchen. When Amelia found out that Linda was pregnant, she was overjoyed. Finally, after 5 years, she would have a grandson or granddaughter. She began to imagine walking down the avenue with a pram, looking at the sleeping baby. But what she heard shattered all her dreams. "So I'm not wanted here," she got up from the sofa and walked to the window, where it was already dark. "Well," she sighed heavily, "they have their own family, and I'll live somehow. How much of that life is left?" In the morning, when Albert had gone to work, Amelia took out a checkered notebook from her bedside table, tore out a piece of paper, and began to write something. She didn't go out for a walk as usual that day, and didn't mind that an irritated Linda was pacing around the flat and even dropped a stool in the kitchen a few times, kicking it with her foot. In the evening when Albert came home, Amelia came into the kitchen and sat down across from him. "Son, I need to talk to you," she said. "What's wrong, Mum?" Albert looked at her anxiously. "Is it something serious?" "You see, son, it's like this. Amelia was silent for a while. I have to go away, probably for a long time." "Why?" Where Albert wondered. "I got a letter from Aunt Gwen today." Amelia took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and showed it to Albert, but did not hand it to him. "Well, do you remember Aunt Gwen, your grandmother's cousin?" "How would you remember her? When we went to the village, you were very young." "Aunt Gwen says she's ill and needs help," Amelia said quickly, so that her son wouldn't understand. "She has no family left and no one to look after her. So Aunt Gwen asked me to look after her, and in return she'll give me the deed to her house. It's a good house. It'll last 100 years. Then you can sell it, add some money, and buy you a flat." Albert stretched out. "Well, if you have to, go. But let's leave at the weekend so I can walk you to the bus." No, Amelia waved her hands fearfully. "I'll go tomorrow. Aunt Gwen writes to tell me to leave right away. I don't know how long the letter has been traveling. It might be too late. Don't worry. I haven't got much. Why don't Linda at least come with you?" Albert offered tentatively. "What's the matter, son?" She waved her hand again. "Linda is in such a state now that she needs to take care of herself. Don't worry, I'll get there myself." "How's that?" Albert got up from the table. "Will you be back in time for the birth of our child?" I don't know. Amelia shook her head. "I'm not going to guess. I don't know how things will turn out. Maybe I'll live there and stay there for good. So you can use the flat as you see fit, move into the big room. And you can make a nursery in the small one. Well, it's up to you. We'll figure it out." Albert left the kitchen and went into the room, where Linda's joyful voice could be heard. Amelia tore up the letter she had written to herself that morning and threw it in the rubbish bin. Then she went back to her room, opened the wardrobe, and started pulling out her things, putting them into a small traveling bag. Almost 3 years had passed. Albert and Linda's family life was not going well. She reproached her husband for not devoting time to her or their little daughter. Albert replied that he worked 2 jobs so that the family did not need anything, because Linda's needs were growing more and more every day. And it was taking a lot of money for the baby. Over time, Albert realized that he probably didn't really love Linda, but was just fascinated by her beauty and attractiveness. And now it was as if a veil had fallen from his eyes. Linda turned out to be a very scandalous wife. She wanted Albert to help her around the house and earn a lot. He did not refuse to help his wife, coming back from work, bringing groceries. On rare weekends, he cleaned the flat and cooked meals. But he resented the fact that Linda sat all day on the phone, texting with girlfriends or ordering some things through an online shop. She did not do much with her daughter, who fortunately grew up a very quiet child and could play with toys on her own, without causing her mother much trouble. In addition, Albert was very offended at his wife for naming the newborn girl Angelina without consulting him. "What kind of name is that?" Albert was outraged at the time. "I thought we were going to name our daughter Iris or Joyce or maybe Laura." "Phew," Linda replied, embarrassed. "Iris, Joyce. It's like the countryside, but Angelina. It's trendy and modern." Linda was supported by her mother-in-law, and Albert waved his hand. "Call it what you like." Only his father-in-law sided with him. "They'll call the girl Oliver Laughed, like a cow in an advert." The family was always short of money. Instead of saving a little, Linda ordered cosmetics and clothes she hardly ever wore. The wardrobe was full of her stuff. Those cosmetics were still in her nightstand drawer. Stop wasting money. Albert once told his wife, "We'll never save for our own flat." Why do we need a flat? Linda wondered. We're doing fine here for now. When Angelina grows up a little more, we'll exchange this flat for a bigger place. What do you mean? Albert looked at her in confusion. Actually, my mom is also registered here. She's gone to the country for a while. She can come back at any moment. This is already our flat. Linda looked at her husband angrily. Look, she circled the room with her hand. Where are we going to put your mom? And anyway, if she hasn't come here for so many years, she won't come back now. Albert thought about it. He hadn't heard from his mom in 3 years. He had never even visited her in the village. He decided that he would have to go there next weekend to see how she was doing. Maybe she needs some help. But soon Albert forgot about his promise. He got busy at work and had another fight with Linda. Or rather, they fought every night now. He hardly got home, and his mother-in-law was adding fuel to the fire. Other husbands to their wives and buy fur coats. And take to resorts, she said with a complaint son-in-law. And you in life, even a gold ring, cannot give a gift, which she has long dreamed of. So let her find a husband who will provide her with everything. Albert snapped back. Since I'm so bad. And she will nod at the mother-in-law. A beautiful girl like my daughter will never be left alone. She deserves the best. So let her go to the best. Albert couldn't stand it one day when his mother-in-law again reproached him for not earning enough money. I won't cry. Might as well pack my things now and get out of here. That's right. The mother-in-law proudly raised her head and turned to her daughter. Linda, get ready. We're not staying in this flat with this worthless man for another minute. Linda defiantly started to take things out of the wardrobe and put them into a large bag. Albert watched silently. We'll take the baby with us. Too, the mother-in-law began to stuff toys into the bag. My dear Angelina, your father is worthless. If he can't provide not only for his wife but also for his child. Take it. Albert shrugged indifferently. Nobody will forbid me to see my daughter anyway. We'll see about that. The mother-in-law grabbed her granddaughter by the hand and pulled her into the hallway. Linda followed them, dragging her bag. Don't forget to leave the keys to the flat, Albert reminded her. Choke on it. Linda took the keys out of her purse and threw them at her husband. You'll be sorry, but it'll be too late. Yeah, Albert nodded and slammed the door behind them. Linda cried in the taxi. Mum, maybe I shouldn't have left Albert. No way, said her mother firmly. Let him suffer. You'll see he'll come to you on his knees and beg for forgiveness. But don't be a fool and forgive him at once. Let him buy you a ring and a mink fur coat, which you have long dreamed of. That's true, Linda wiped her tears. Let him suffer, and I'll think about whether to forgive him or not. Sweet Angelina sat between her grandmother and mother and didn't understand what was happening. She was very sad that they had left her daddy, whom she loved very much. Albert did not show up at her mother-in-law's and father-in-law's flat the next day or a week later. There was also no call from him on his wife's phone. Should I call him myself? Linda asked her mom anxiously. Don't you dare. Miranda looked at her daughter angrily. He'll think you're humiliating yourself in front of him, and he'll stop appreciating you. Let's wait a little longer. Albert, meanwhile, felt almost happy. He missed his daughter, but at the same time he enjoyed his bachelor life. He was happy to come home after work, where no one reproached him or made scandals. Albert also realized that he missed his mother, her gentle voice, her care, her hard and yet soft hands. He lay awake all night remembering how he and his mother had gone to a cafe to eat ice cream, and how they had ridden on a merry-go-round in the park. and his mother had clutched her son's hand tightly out of fear. He remembered her fragrant pancakes, delicious pancakes, his favorite potato pies. The next day, Albert took a day off work and went to the railway station. When he reached the village, he got out and looked around confused. He didn't know where to go next. He couldn't remember the house where Aunt Gwen and now Mum lived. So he decided to ask the first person he saw for directions. "Excuse me, please," he said to the postman, who was just delivering his pension. "I need to find a house. Only I don't know the landlady's surname. Her name is Gwen, and my mum Amelia lives with her now." "You must know her. You probably bring her a pension too, don't you?" "I don't remember her," grumbled the postman. "There used to be a Mrs. Anna Robinson. She went to the city to see her daughter, and then she came back here and died. Her house has long since been sold." "So that's my grandmother." Albert rejoiced. She had a cousin, Aunt Gwen, whom my mother came to look after. "Oh, I remember," the postman nodded. "You must be talking about Gwen Hopkins." She began flipping through the lists of residents and shook her head in the negative. "No, we don't have her listed. Who does she look like to you?" "That's my mum." Albert lowered his head. "She lied to me when she said she had gone to the village to look after her aunt. I went to the village yesterday. Mum didn't even show up there. Now I don't know where to find her. I had hoped she lived here." He sighed heavily. "Alas, my hopes were not fulfilled. So I'll keep looking until I find her." "Why did she deceive you?" The woman looked at Albert with interest. "What did you do?" "I turned out to be a soulless son." He inclined his head even lower. "And now I want to make up for that mistake." "Oh, if you knew how many old people live in our house who have been abandoned by their children," the woman sighed. "Everyone has a story to tell. Take Mrs. Anna Smith, who was brought to us after being picked up off the street. She'd been wandering around the town for days, sleeping at the railway station. The old woman said she'd lost her memory. She just called herself Anna, but she could not remember her surname or address where she lived, no matter how they questioned her. She didn't have any ID on her. We'd already given her the name Smith, as well as another name. When she was registered with us, we couldn't even find her relatives," the woman continued. "We don't know her real name or date of birth. She doesn't even receive a pension. We collected clothes for her, as they say, with the whole world, because she came to us with one small purse, which contained almost nothing, not even documents. When she had a bad cold, she repeated only the name Albert in her delirium. We thought it was her son, who must have kicked his mother out of the house when she lost her memory." Albert suddenly remembered that he had found his mum's passport when he was sorting out his papers. So she didn't take it or forgot to put it in her bag. And the name Anna made me suspicious. That was my grandmother's name. "Is this old woman alive?" he asked cautiously. "Can I see her?" Well, the woman rose from her seat. "Come on, I'll show her to you." Albert recognized the old woman sitting on the bed as his mother, who had aged and lost even more weight. "Mum," he called softly. Amelia flinched and turned round. "Albert, my son," she exclaimed, unable to believe her eyes. Mummy, I'm sorry." Albert fell on his knees in front of her and cried. "I am so guilty before you." "Calm down, my darling." Amelia stroked his head with her wrinkled hand. "I knew I would see you again. I believed you'd find me." "Mum, come on, let's go home." "You're not staying here anymore?" "Home?" Amelia looked at her son confused. "But I'll be in the way of everything. I'd rather stay here and you can visit me often." "You won't bother anyone," Albert assured her. "I live alone. I'm preparing for a divorce. I don't want such a wife. We'll live with you again, just the two of us. And sometimes Angelina will come to visit us. Is that your new fiancé? Amelia looked angrily at her son. Angelina is my daughter, he laughed. And your granddaughter, whom you must meet? Albert asked. I have a granddaughter? Amelia was now crying with happiness. Yes, yes, Albert, you do. Amelia fussed. I'll pack quickly and we'll go home. I don't have much stuff, but I have enough. Thank you to the kind people who gave me everything I need. And thank them for not leaving me to die in the street. When Amelia entered her room, she stopped on the threshold, hesitating to go any further. Mum, what are you doing? Albert was surprised. Come in, come in. You're the rightful owner of this place now. I didn't think I'd ever come back here again, she said, looking round. Maybe I should go back to the old people's home. Amelia looked anxiously at her son. Would you make up with Linda and move on with your life? You have a daughter growing up. How will she be without her father? I'll see my daughter, but I won't live with Linda anymore, Albert said. Let's not bring it up again. Come on, I'd better show you your room. He took his mother to the room where Angelina used to live. Now you'll live here and no one will bother you. What about you, son? Amelia got worried. Will you be uncomfortable in a passageway room? What if I have to go to the loo in the middle of the night? I'll go and wake you up. You won't? Albert laughed. I sleep so soundly that a tank will pass by and I won't hear it. Come on, Mom. Make yourself comfortable. And tomorrow you and I will go to the shop to buy you clothes and anything else you need. I'll cook something. You and I are going to eat. And you're going to tell me how you've lived all these years. Albert was just finishing frying potatoes when his phone rang. Linda appeared on the screen. He wrinkled his nose and didn't answer the call. The phone rang again and again. Albert even had to switch it off so it wouldn't interfere with his communication with his mom. After about an hour, someone rang the doorbell. Who the hell is that? Albert grumbled as he clicked the lock. Linda stood on the doorstep. Why don't you answer my calls and messages? She asked indignantly. Do you want me to resent you even more? She pushed Albert away and walked into the hallway. If you apologize to me now, then so be it. Linda looked condescendingly at her husband. I will forgive you, but for the last time. If it happens again, you will never see me again. I don't want to see you now, Albert replied calmly. Why did you come here? Linda noticed her mother-in-law, who came out of her room. What is that one doing in our flat? She pointed at Amelia. That's my mum, Albert frowned. And now she's going to live here with me. And you don't belong here anymore. Go away. He waved his hand towards the door. You have nothing to do with this flat. Then you'll never see our daughter again, Linda used the last argument. I'll terminate your paternity. We'll talk about it in court. Albert was unfazed. No one can stop me from having contact with my child, so calm down and leave. I'll file for divorce myself so you don't have to bother. Albert, Linda suddenly cried, why don't we try to start over? If you want, we can move in with my parents, or rent a flat. Let your mum live here. I'm sorry, but I don't love you anymore, Albert shook his head. And you probably don't love me either. What's the point of having a family like this? Can I at least take the rest of my things? Her voice trembled with excitement. I don't mind. Take it, he allowed. Just hurry up. Mum's tired, and it's time for her to rest. Without saying hello to her mother-in-law, Linda quickly packed everything she needed into bags and went out the door. Son, maybe you shouldn't do that to Linda? Amelia asked cautiously. I don't know what's wrong, said Amelia. There's no such thing as a husband and wife. They had a fight. They make up. No, Mum, I can't do that, Albert shook his head. Remember how Grandma used to say there's heaven in a cage with a sweetheart, so I want to live in love and harmony. And who else but you, Mom, would love me so sincerely and completely unselfishly? You've always loved me more than anyone else in the world. And now I have to take care of you. I'm the happiest man in the world because I have you, Mom.